When a disgraced nobleman arrives at a crumbling estate he purchased for mere pennies, the locals whisper that he's finally lost his mind. Lord Edmund Ashford has nothing left but his name and his faithful hound Jasper. The old manor stands broken on the edge of forgotten countryside, its walls holding secrets buried for generations. While society mocks him for clinging to ruins, Edmund sees something others cannot, a chance at rebuilding what was lost. But on his third morning, Jasper begins digging frantically beneath a collapsed garden wall, uncovering stone steps leading down into darkness. What lies beneath will change everything Edmund thought he knew about his family's past and his own future. Could the very thing that destroyed his ancestors also hold the key to his redemption? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The carriage rattled along the rutted country road, each jolt sending waves of discomfort through Edmund's already weary body. He pressed his hand against the window frame, steadying himself as they rounded another bend. Through the rain-streaked glass, the landscape transformed from cultivated farmland into something wilder, more untamed. Ancient oaks lined the roadway, their gnarled branches reaching across like arthritic fingers, grasping at the grey sky above. Jasper, his liver and white Springer Spaniel, sat beside him on the worn leather seat. The dog's ears perked at every new sound, every shift in the carriage's movement. Edmund reached down and stroked the soft fur behind Jasper's ears, drawing comfort from the animal's steady warmth. "Nearly there now, old friend," Edmund murmured. The dog's brown eyes looked up at him with an understanding that went beyond mere animal instinct. Jasper had been with him through everything, through the scandal, through the bankruptcy proceedings, through the endless parade of creditors and lawyers. When society turned its back, when supposed friends vanished like morning mist, Jasper remained. The driver's voice cut through the drum of rain on the carriage roof. "Thornfield Manor ahead, sir." Edmund leaned forward. Through the grey curtain of rain, he caught his first true glimpse of his inheritance. Thornfield Manor rose from the landscape like a wounded giant. The central structure still stood, 3 stories of weathered stone and dark windows, but the east wing had partially collapsed. Ivy and creeping vines claimed what remained, transforming ruin into something almost organic. The Gothic spires that once proclaimed the Ashford family's prominence now pointed accusingly at heaven, their gargoyles eroded by centuries of wind and rain. The carriage lurched to a stop before the main entrance. The massive oak doors hung slightly askew on their iron hinges, and several windows on the ground floor were boarded shut. Edmund sat motionless for a moment, staring at the edifice that represented both his family's past glory and his last desperate gamble at survival. "Will you be needing help with the trunk, sir?" The driver's tone held a note of pity that Edmund had grown accustomed to, but never quite accepted. "No, thank you. Just place them inside the entrance. Someone should be here to receive us." Edmund stepped down from the carriage, his boots sinking slightly into the muddy drive. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but the October air bit through his coat. Jasper bounded out beside him, immediately beginning an investigation of the grounds, his tail wagging despite the gloomy atmosphere. The sound of the heavy doors opening drew Edmund's attention. A woman emerged, perhaps 60 years of age, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a simple black dress and white apron, her face weathered but not unkind. "Lord Ashford," she said, offering a slight curtsy. "I'm Mrs. Dalton. I've been maintaining the manor as best I can with limited means." Edmund climbed the stone steps to the entrance. "Mrs. Dalton, your letters were most thorough. I appreciate your dedication to the property. Your grandfather was a good man, sir. I served your family for 40 years before everything went to pieces." Her eyes swept over the crumbling facade. "I couldn't bear to see Thornfield fall completely to ruin." They stood together in the doorway as the driver deposited Edmund's modest collection of trunks inside the entrance hall. Edmund pressed several coins into the man's hand, watching as the carriage disappeared back down the tree-lined drive. "Come in out of the weather, sir." Mrs. Dalton said. "I've prepared the master bedroom and lit a fire in the library. It's the only room where the chimney still draws properly." Edmund stepped across the threshold, Jasper padding in beside him. The entrance hall stretched before them, grand despite its decay. A magnificent staircase curved upward, its banister carved with the Ashford family crest. But water stains marked the plaster walls, and several ceiling beams showed signs of rot. Still, beneath the damage, Edmund could sense the manor's former magnificence. "The east wing is unsafe, sir," Mrs. Dalton continued, leading him deeper into the house. "The roof collapsed during a storm 5 years past. I've kept the main section secure, though there's much that needs attention." They passed through a series of rooms, each filled with furniture draped in dust sheets. Portraits of stern-faced Ashfords watched from the walls, their eyes seeming to judge Edmund's reduced circumstances. He paused before one painting, his grandfather as a young man, proud and confident. "He never spoke much about Thornfield," Edmund said quietly. "Always changed the subject when I asked about the old days." Mrs. Dalton's expression grew thoughtful. "Your grandfather had his reasons, sir. Some memories are best left undisturbed." The library occupied the northwest corner of the ground floor. True to Mrs. Dalton's word, a modest fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Many volumes had suffered water damage, their leather bindings warped and mildewed, but hundreds more remained intact. Edmund's eyes fell upon a desk near the window, and atop it, a leather-bound ledger. He crossed the room and opened it, revealing page after page of careful entries in faded ink. The Ashford family ledger. His breath caught as he traced the dates. 1792, 1803, 1821, 1847. The last entries were in his grandfather's hand, dated 1873, just before the old man's death. "I found it in a trunk in the attic," Mrs. Dalton said. "Thought you might want to see it." Edmund nodded slowly, running his fingers across the water-damaged pages. Here, in meticulous detail, was the story of his family's decline. Entries documenting investments lost, properties sold, debts accumulated. Generation after generation watching their fortune drain away like water through cupped hands. "Thank you, Mrs. Dalton. That will be all for now." When she had gone, Edmund sank into the chair behind the desk, the ledger open before him. Jasper settled at his feet, resting his head on Edmund's boot. Outside, darkness gathered, and the rain resumed its steady percussion against the windows. Edmund lit an oil lamp and began to read, searching for understanding in the faded ink of the past. Morning light filtered through the library windows, revealing the full extent of Thornfield's neglect. Edmund had spent most of the night reading the ledger, dozing fitfully in the chair as the fire burned low. His neck ached, and his eyes felt gritty from strain and lack of proper sleep. Mrs. Dalton appeared with a breakfast tray, her expression disapproving but sympathetic. "You should have rested properly, sir." The master bedroom was prepared. "I couldn't pull myself away." Edmund gestured to the ledger. 3 generations of decline, all documented here. My grandfather's final entry speaks of a burden passed down, something he couldn't bring himself to face. "The past weighs heavy on this place," Mrs. Dalton said, setting the tray down. "Best you see to the present. Thomas Webb will be here within the hour. He's the groundskeeper, though there's precious little ground left to keep these days." Edmund forced himself to eat, though the porridge sat heavy in his stomach. His thoughts kept returning to the ledger's cryptic final passages. What burden had his grandfather meant? What had he been too afraid to confront? By mid-morning, Edmund felt restless within the manor's confines. He needed to understand the village, the community that would be his neighbours. Mrs. Dalton had mentioned that Millbrook lay just 2 miles down the road, a market town that had once thrived under Ashford patronage. "Come, Jasper," Edmund called, reaching for his coat. "Let's see what sort of welcome awaits us." The walk to Millbrook took him along a pleasant country lane, though neglect showed here as well. Stone walls that should have been maintained had collapsed in places, and the road itself bore deep ruts that would make carriage travel treacherous in wet weather. Jasper ranged ahead, investigating every hedgerow and gatepost with boundless enthusiasm. The village appeared gradually, first a few scattered cottages, then the clustered buildings of the main street. Millbrook had a timeless quality to it, with its Tudor-fronted shops and cobbled square. The church dominated the skyline, its Norman tower solid and reassuring. Yet Edmund noticed the subtle signs of decline. Shops with dusty windows, fewer people on the streets than a town this size should have. An air of resignation that seemed to hang over everything. He made his way to the Ploughman's Rest, the public house that Mrs. Dalton had mentioned as the heart of village social life. A painted sign swung creaking in the breeze above the door. Edmund tied Jasper's lead to a post and stepped inside. Conversation died the moment he entered. A dozen faces turned toward him, eyes widening in recognition or perhaps surprise. Edmund had forgotten what a figure he must cut. A lord without a fortune, fallen from grace, yet still bearing the manner and accent of his class. "Good morning, gentlemen," Edmund said, moving to the bar. "I'm Edmund Ashford. I've taken residence at Thornfield Manor." The innkeeper, a broad man with a florid face, regarded him with undisguised curiosity. "We heard you'd arrived, sir. Tom Whitmore, proprietor." "What can I get you?" "A pint of your best ale, thank you." As the innkeeper poured, Edmund became aware of whispered conversations resuming around him. He caught fragments. "Ashford's back. Bankrupt, they say. Bought the place for nothing. Curse on that family." An elderly man at the nearest table cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, Lord Ashford, but you're a braver man than most. That place has stood empty going on 5 years now. Someone needed to take responsibility for it," Edmund replied, accepting his ale. "I'm the last of my line. If I don't restore it, no one will." "Restore it!" Another man laughed without humor. "With what?" "Everyone knows you're as skint as a church mouse. The whole city's been talking about your bankruptcy." Edmund felt heat rise in his cheeks, but kept his voice level. "Financial setbacks don't erase obligation. My family owned that land for 300 years. I'll see it right again, one way or another." The door opened, admitting a tall man in clerical garb. He must have been in his 70s, with a shock of white hair and keen blue eyes that took in the scene immediately. "Ah, you must be young Ashford," he said, moving forward with surprising energy. "I'm Reverend Blackwood. Your grandfather and I were friends, back in better days." Edmund shook the offered hand gratefully. "You knew my grandfather well." "As well as anyone, I suppose, though Richard kept his own counsel about certain matters." The Reverend's expression grew thoughtful. "Walk with me, if you would. There are things you should know about Thornfield, things that aren't widely discussed." They left the pub together, Jasper falling into step beside them as they made their way toward the church. The Reverend led Edmund through the old graveyard, past weathered headstones and elaborate monuments to long-dead villagers. "Your family's history with Millbrook goes deep," Blackwood began. "Deeper than most records show. There was a time when the Ashfords were the lifeblood of this community. They provided employment, supported the church, maintained the roads. But something happened back in your great-great-grandfather's time. A scandal of some sort. The details were hushed up, but the effects rippled through generations. The ledger mentions a burden," Edmund said. "Do you know what that means?" Blackwood stopped before a particularly grand monument, the Ashford family vault. "I have suspicions. When I was a young curate, I found certain documents in the parish records. References to unusual activities at Thornfield in the 1790s. Meetings held in secret. Large sums of money changing hands with no clear explanation. Smuggling? Edmund ventured, perhaps. Or something more significant." The Reverend pulled a key from his pocket and unlocked the church's side door. "Come, let me show you something." They entered the cool dimness of the church, their footsteps echoing on the stone floor. Blackwood led Edmund to a small room behind the vestry where the parish archives were kept. He pulled a leather-bound volume from a shelf, its pages crackling with age. "The Millbrook Parish Records, 1788 to 1815, Blackwood said, opening the book carefully. "Notice these entries here concerning the Ashford family. Baptisms, marriages, burials, all quite normal. But look at the margins." Edmund peered closer. In faded ink, barely visible, someone had made notations, symbols and numbers that meant nothing to him. "I've spent years trying to decipher these," Blackwood admitted. "I believe they're some form of code or record system, and they correspond to dates when significant political events were occurring. The French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars. You think my ancestors were involved in something to do with the wars?" "I think they were patriots, Edmund, but perhaps patriots who operated outside conventional bounds." The Reverend closed the book gently. "Your grandfather once told me that the Ashfords had sacrificed everything for king and country, but that no one would ever know or appreciate what they'd done. He said the truth was buried at Thornfield, along with the family's honor." Edmund's mind raced. Could the ledger's mysterious burden be connected to this? Was there truly something hidden at the manor, something beyond mere memory? "Thank you, Reverend," Edmund said finally. "You've given me much to consider." Walking back to Thornfield with Jasper trotting beside him, Edmund felt the weight of revelation settling on his shoulders. The crumbling manor was more than just a financial burden. It was the keeper of secrets that might explain everything. That evening, Edmund finally moved his belongings into the master bedroom. Mrs. Dalton had done her best to make the room habitable, airing the bedding and dusting the heavy furniture, but decades of neglect couldn't be erased in an afternoon. The four-poster bed dominated the space, its curtains moth-eaten but still bearing traces of their original burgundy splendor. A massive wardrobe stood against one wall, its doors slightly warped from moisture. Edmund unpacked methodically, hanging his few good suits and placing his personal effects on the dressing table. His movements were automatic, his mind still churning over Reverend Blackwood's revelations. Patriots who operated outside conventional bounds. What did that mean? Spies, couriers, something more dangerous? Jasper had already claimed his spot near the fireplace, where Mrs. Dalton had arranged a thick rug. The dog watched Edmund with alert eyes, his head resting on his paws. "What do you make of all this, old friend?" Edmund asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Have we traded one sort of trouble for another?" The manor seemed to answer with a groan of settling timbers and the distant sound of wind moving through empty rooms. Edmund lit several candles, pushing back the darkness that gathered in the corners. The single oil lamp Mrs. Dalton had provided cast long shadows across the walls. He was reaching for his nightshirt when he noticed something wedged behind the dressing table. Edmund pulled the heavy piece of furniture away from the wall, revealing a small leather case that had fallen into the gap. His heart quickened as he recognized the initials embossed on the cover, R.A. Richard Ashford. His grandfather. Inside, he found a gentleman's pocket watch, its gold case tarnished but still beautiful. Edmund pressed the release and the cover sprang open. The watch had stopped at precisely midnight, the hands frozen in place. But it was the inscription inside the cover that made Edmund's breath catch. "Time stands still for those who wait beneath," it read, in elegant script. "Patience guards what haste would destroy." Edmund turned the watch over in his hands, feeling its weight, its reality. This had belonged to his grandfather, been held by those familiar hands, consulted perhaps thousands of times. Why had it been left here, hidden behind furniture? And what did the inscription mean? He wound the mechanism, but the watch refused to start. The gears were locked or corroded. Edmund set it carefully on the nightstand and finished preparing for bed, but sleep felt distant now. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and moaning through gaps in the old frame. Edmund lay in the darkness, listening to the manor's night sounds. Jasper shifted occasionally, and Edmund found comfort in the dog's steady breathing. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Edmund sat up, every muscle tensed. The sound came from somewhere above, in what should have been empty rooms. Steady, deliberate footsteps crossing a floor, pausing, then continuing. His rational mind offered explanations. Timbers contracting in the cold, mice in the walls, branches scraping against the roof. But the rhythm was too regular, too human. Jasper's ears pricked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. "Easy, boy," Edmund whispered, reaching for the poker beside the fireplace. Probably just the house settling, but even as he said it, the footsteps continued. They seemed to move along the corridor above, then stop directly overhead. Edmund held his breath, every sense straining. For a long moment there was only silence, then something else, a dragging sound, as if heavy furniture was being moved across the floor. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Edmund waited, poker gripped tight until his arms ached and his breathing had steadied. No further sounds came. Gradually he allowed himself to relax, though he kept the poker within reach as he settled back onto the pillow. Just the wind and old timbers, he told himself firmly. Nothing more. But sleep, when it finally came, was restless and filled with dreams of hidden rooms and sealed passages, of his grandfather's worried face leaning close to whisper warnings that Edmund could never quite hear. He woke with dawn light streaming through the windows, momentarily disoriented. Jasper stood by the door, whining softly. Edmund dressed quickly and let the dog out, following him down to the entrance hall. Mrs. Dalton was already at work in the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread filling the air. She looked up as Edmund entered, her expression troubled. "Strange night, sir. You look as though you didn't rest well. The manor makes interesting." "Sounds in the darkness," Edmund replied carefully. "Nothing to be concerned about, I'm sure." "My old room is in the west wing," Mrs. Dalton said, kneading dough with strong, practiced movements. "I sleep light, always have." "I heard it too, sir. The footsteps. They come most nights, always in the same pattern. Walk, pause, then that dragging sound." Edmund felt a chill despite the kitchen's warmth. "You've heard this before? Why didn't you mention it in your letters?" "Because I knew what you'd think, sir. That I was an old woman with too much imagination. But it's real enough. Been happening for years, long before I came here. My mother worked in this house when she was young, back in your great-grandfather's time. She heard them too." "There must be a rational explanation," Edmund insisted. Mrs. Dalton gave him a long look. "Perhaps there is, sir. Perhaps those sounds are trying to tell us something. Perhaps whatever your grandfather couldn't face, whatever burden he spoke of, makes itself known in the night. I've never been brave enough to investigate. But you're a younger man. If you're minded to look, the stairs to the upper floor are through the door at the end of the east corridor." Edmund nodded slowly, his hand unconsciously reaching for the pocket watch he'd placed in his waistcoat. Its weight was reassuring, a tangible connection to his grandfather. "I think," he said carefully, "that it's time I explored the manor more thoroughly. Every room, every passage. If there's something here that demands attention, better to face it in daylight." "Thomas Webb should be here within the hour," Mrs. Dalton said. "He knows the estate better than anyone. Best to have him with you when you go into the damaged sections. Some of those floors aren't safe." Edmund returned to his room to collect his coat and hat. Jasper danced around his feet, sensing an adventure. As Edmund pulled on his gloves, his eyes fell again on the pocket watch, its hands still frozen at midnight. Time stands still for those who wait beneath. Beneath what? Beneath the manor? Beneath suspicion? Or beneath something more literal? Something hidden below ground? He picked up the watch, feeling its stillness, its arrested moment. Then he slipped it into his pocket and headed downstairs to wait for Thomas Webb. Whatever secrets Thornfield held, whatever caused those midnight footsteps, Edmund was determined to uncover them. Thomas Webb arrived precisely at 9 o'clock. A weathered man in his late 50s, with the calloused hands of someone who'd spent his life working the land. His face bore the deep lines of outdoor living, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Lord Ashford," he said, touching his cap. "Been tending these grounds since I was a boy. My father worked for your grandfather, and his father before him. We're Thornfield people, sir, through and through." Edmund shook his hand, appreciating the firm grip. "Mrs. Dalton speaks highly of your dedication. I'll need your guidance in understanding what can be salvaged here." They spent the morning walking the grounds together, Webb pointing out damaged sections of wall, overgrown paths, and areas where the formal gardens had reverted to wilderness. Jasper ranged ahead of them, investigating every corner with enthusiasm. The East Garden was once the pride of the estate, Webb said, as they approached a section of high stone wall nearly hidden by ivy. Your great-grandfather laid it out himself, brought in exotic plants from all over the empire. Most of it's gone wild now, but the bones are still good. Edmund studied the wall, noting the elaborate stonework and the arched gateway that led into what must have once been an enclosed garden space. Beyond it, he could see tangled roses and overgrown hedges fighting for supremacy. "We'll need to clear all this," Edmund began, but stopped as Jasper suddenly began barking urgently. The dog had his front paws up against a section of the wall, scratching at the stone with unusual intensity. "Jasper, down!" Edmund called, but the dog ignored him completely. This was unusual. Jasper had always been obedient, almost eerily so. Webb frowned. That's odd behavior for such a well-trained animal. They approached the wall where Jasper continued his frantic investigation. The dog had begun digging at the base, his paws working rapidly to displace the accumulated earth and debris. "Probably found a rabbit hole," Webb suggested, but his tone was uncertain. Edmund knelt beside Jasper, trying to pull him back, but the dog resisted. His digging had exposed something unusual. The earth here wasn't natural soil. It was more like crushed mortar and building debris, as if something had been deliberately filled in. "Wait," Edmund said, his interest piqued. "Let him continue." Webb produced a small trowel from his work bag, and together they began carefully removing the loose material. Jasper worked alongside them, his tail wagging furiously as if he understood the importance of their task. Within minutes, they had exposed the top of what appeared to be stone steps, their edges worn smooth by age. The steps descended at a steep angle, disappearing into darkness beneath the garden wall. "I've never seen this before," Webb said, his voice hushed with surprise, "and I've walked every inch of these grounds for 40 years. Edmund brushed away more debris, revealing 3 more steps. The stonework was ancient, far older than the current wall. These steps had been deliberately concealed, covered over and hidden from view. "Help me clear more of this," Edmund instructed, his hands already working at the compacted earth. His heart raced with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Could this be connected to his grandfather's mysterious burden? To the cryptic inscription on the pocket watch? They worked steadily for over an hour, removing accumulated dirt and broken stone. The steps continued downward, at least 12 or 15 of them, leading to what appeared to be a doorway carved into the foundation of the wall itself. Mrs. Dalton appeared with a lunch basket, her face blanching when she saw what they'd uncovered. "Lord, preserve us," she whispered. "The old stories were true." "What stories?" Edmund demanded, standing and brushing dirt from his knees. "My mother used to speak of hidden ways beneath Thornfield. She said the old lord, your great-great-grandfather, had passages built for purposes he never disclosed. Some said for smuggling, others said for darker reasons. But I never believed it was real." Edmund descended the steps carefully, testing each one before putting his full weight on it. At the bottom, he found himself facing a heavy iron door, its surface covered in rust and corrosion. A large ring hung from its center, and around the frame were carved symbols he didn't recognize. "We'll need tools to open this," Webb said, peering over Edmund's shoulder. "That door hasn't been opened in a lifetime or more." But Edmund's attention had been drawn to something else. Set into the stone lintel above the door was a small niche, and within it rested an object that made his breath catch. An iron ring, ornate despite the rust, wrought in the shape of intertwined serpents. Their eyes were formed from small green stones that still held their luster despite the centuries. He reached up carefully and grasped the ring. It came away from its resting place with surprising ease, and as it did, he heard a distinct click from within the door mechanism. "Did you hear that?" Edmund asked. Webb nodded, his face grave. Sounds like this was meant to be found, sir. That ring must be part of the locking mechanism. Edmund tried turning the large ring in the door's center. It resisted at first, the rust of years fighting against his efforts, but gradually it began to move. The screech of metal on metal echoed in the enclosed space, making them all wince. "Are you certain you want to do this, sir?" Mrs. Dalton asked from the top of the steps. "Some doors are closed for good reason." Edmund paused, his hand still gripping the ring. He thought of his grandfather's final words in the ledger. He thought of the mysterious footsteps in the night. He thought of his ruined fortune and his desperate need for answers. "My family has spent generations running from whatever lies beyond this door," he said quietly. "I won't continue that tradition." He pulled hard on the ring. The door shifted, then groaned open, revealing a passage that disappeared into absolute darkness. The air that emerged was cold and stale, carrying with it the scent of damp stone. And something else, something Edmund couldn't quite identify. Jasper whined softly, pressing against Edmund's leg, but whether in fear or eagerness, Edmund couldn't tell. "We'll need lanterns," Webb said practically, "and rope, in case the passages are unstable. This needs to be approached carefully, sir." Edmund nodded, still staring into the darkness beyond the door. "Tomorrow morning, we'll come prepared and explore properly." He pulled the door closed again, the iron ring still clutched in his hand. "But tonight, I want to research what we've found. There must be references to these passages somewhere in the manor's papers." As they climbed back to ground level, Edmund couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The manor's secrets were beginning to yield themselves to investigation, but what those secrets might reveal remained uncertain. The iron ring in his hand felt heavy with significance, its serpent forms seeming to writhe in the afternoon light. That evening, Edmund spread maps and old documents across the library table, searching for any reference to underground passages. Jasper lay nearby, occasionally lifting his head, as if listening to sounds only he could detect. And in Edmund's pocket, the stopped watch rested silent, its inscription seeming more prophetic. With each passing hour, Edmund spent the night poring over every document he could find in the library. Old estate maps, yellowed correspondence, account books from decades past. But nothing referenced underground passages or hidden vaults. It was as if that entire aspect of Thornfield's architecture had been deliberately erased from the official records. At dawn, frustrated and exhausted, he decided to explore the outbuildings. If the passages truly dated from his great-great-grandfather's time, there might be other clues scattered about the estate. Tools, plans, anything that might shed light on what lay beneath. The old smithy stood at the far end of what had once been the stable yard. Its roof had partially collapsed, and ivy claimed much of the exterior walls. Edmund pushed open the warped door, ducking beneath a low beam. Morning light filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. Inside, the forge stood cold and silent, its chimney crumbling. Anvil and workbench remained, covered in rust and bird droppings. Tools hung on the walls, their wooden handles cracked and weathered. This had been a working smithy once, capable of producing everything from horseshoes to decorative ironwork. Edmund moved methodically through the space, examining everything. In a corner, he found stacks of old horseshoes and broken tools. Behind them, nearly hidden, was a heavy wooden chest. The wood was solid oak, iron-bound and locked with a mechanism that had long since rusted solid. He wrestled the chest into better light and examined it closely. No marking identified its contents or purpose, but something about it suggested importance. Why would a locked chest be hidden away in an abandoned smithy? Using a heavy hammer from the workbench, Edmund struck the rusted lock. It took several blows before the old metal shattered, sending fragments skittering across the stone floor. He lifted the lid carefully, uncertain what to expect. Inside lay a collection of objects wrapped in oilcloth. Edmund unwrapped the first bundle, revealing a set of architectural drawings. His hands trembled slightly as he unrolled them on the workbench. They showed Thornfield Manor in meticulous detail, but with additions he'd never seen. Passages beneath the house, connecting the manor to various points on the estate. Chamber after chamber, all underground, forming a network of extraordinary complexity. The second bundle contained what appeared to be a journal, its pages brittle with age. Edmund opened it carefully, reading the faded script. It was written by someone named Blackwell, master builder, and dated 1791. The entries detailed the construction of the underground passages, commissioned by Lord Charles Ashford, Edmund's great-great-grandfather, built at great expense and secrecy, one entry read. Lord Ashford insists no record be kept in the house itself. All plans to be secured here, in the smithy, known only to myself and his lordship. The chambers must be defensible, secure, and capable of withstanding siege. Their purpose remains undisclosed to me, though I suspect matters of state are involved. Edmund felt his pulse quicken. Matters of state. This confirmed what Reverend Blackwood had suggested. His ancestor had been involved in something significant, something that required such elaborate secrecy. The third bundle was the heaviest. Edmund unwrapped it carefully, revealing an iron key of considerable size. Unlike the other metal in the smithy, this key showed no rust. It had been wrapped in oilcloth soaked in some preservative that had protected it through the decades. The key was beautifully crafted, its bow formed into the Ashford family crest, its bit intricate and precise. Attached to the key by a wire loop was a small brass tag, engraved with a single word, Master. Edmund's heart raced. This was the key to the underground passages. Not just one door, but a master key that would open them all. His great-great-grandfather had hidden it here, where only someone searching with determination would find it. He gathered the plans and journal carefully, wrapping them back in their protective cloth. The key he kept in his hand, feeling its weight, its solid reality. This small piece of worked metal represented answers to questions that had plagued his family for generations. Thomas Webb was waiting in the stable yard when Edmund emerged, carrying his findings. The groundskeeper's eyes widened at the sight of the architectural plans. "Lord, preserve us," Webb muttered, studying the drawings. "I've worked this estate my whole life and never suspected such a thing. Look here, sir. This passage runs right beneath the stable yard where we're standing, and this one extends all the way to the old well near the south boundary. We explore today," Edmund said decisively. "Whatever my ancestors built down there, whatever they were trying to protect or hide, I intend to find out." They assembled their supplies carefully. Lanterns, rope, tools for clearing obstacles, and provisions, in case the exploration took longer than expected. Mrs. Dalton packed them a hamper and offered a prayer for their safety, her face showing clear worry. By noon, they stood once more before the iron door beneath the garden wall. Edmund inserted the blacksmith's key into the lock mechanism, his hands steady despite his racing heart. The key turned smoothly, far more easily than the corroded ring had moved the day before. A series of clicks echoed from within the door, and when Edmund pulled, it swung open without resistance. The passage beyond was more substantial than he'd expected. The walls were dressed stone, carefully fitted and still solid after more than a century. The ceiling was vaulted, high enough that a tall man could walk upright without difficulty. Every 10 feet or so brackets had been mounted in the walls, meant for torches or lanterns. "Well built," Webb observed, his voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. "Your ancestors spared no expense on this work." They lit their lanterns and proceeded carefully into the darkness. The passage sloped gently downward away from the manor. The air was cool and surprisingly dry. After perhaps 50 feet, they reached a junction. According to the plans Edmund carried, the left branch led back beneath the house itself, while the right continued toward the old well. "We'll map as we go," Edmund said, producing paper and pencil. "I want to understand the full extent of this network." They took the left branch, moving slowly, examining every detail. The walls showed signs of water damage in places, but overall the construction had held remarkably well. After another 100 feet, they came to a heavy door set into the wall. It bore no markings, but the key Edmund carried opened it easily. Beyond lay a chamber roughly 20 feet square. Shelves lined the walls, though most stood empty now. In one corner, Edmund found several items that made his breath catch. A wooden crate contained old bottles, their contents long since evaporated. Another held rusted metal boxes that might once have contained documents. And in a niche carved into the stone wall, he found personal effects. A silver locket on a delicate chain, a gentleman's ring, a set of brass buttons marked with military insignia. Edmund picked up the locket carefully. Despite the years, it opened smoothly. Inside was a miniature portrait of a beautiful young woman, her hair arranged in the style of the 1790s. On the opposite face of the locket was an inscription, "For Charles, with eternal devotion, M.A., your great-great-grandmother," Webb said softly, looking over Edmund's shoulder. This must have been Lord Charles's private chamber, but it was what Edmund found next that truly captured his attention. Hidden beneath a loose stone in the corner was a small leather-bound notebook, its pages covered in what appeared to be cipher. Complex symbols and number sequences filled page after page, and their meaning opaque but clearly intentional. "We'll need help deciphering this," Edmund said, securing the notebook in his coat pocket, along with the locket. "But I think we're getting closer to understanding what my ancestors were truly involved in." They continued their exploration, marking each chamber and passage on Edmund's growing map. The network was vast, far more extensive than even the architectural plans had suggested. And in every chamber they found hints of secret activities, of a life lived in shadows and silence. Edmund returned to the manor that evening exhausted, but exhilarated. His clothes were filthy from crawling through the underground passages, and his hands bore fresh cuts from moving loose stones. But in his pocket rested the locket and the cipher notebook, tangible evidence that his family's past held more than just decline and scandal. He had barely washed and changed when Mrs. Dalton appeared at his door, her expression troubled. "Mr. Carstairs is here, sir. The banker from Millbrook. He insists on speaking with you immediately." Edmund's momentary elation evaporated. Carstairs! He'd been expecting this visit, dreading it actually. The man had written twice since Edmund's arrival, each letter more insistent than the last. Edmund descended the stairs slowly, steeling himself for what was certain to be an unpleasant conversation. Henry Carstairs waited in the library, a tall man in his 50s with thinning grey hair and the calculating eyes of someone who dealt in numbers and interest rates. His suit was expensive but conservative, his manner polite but cold. "Lord Ashford," he said, rising from the chair he'd appropriated. "Thank you for seeing me. I trust you're settling in to your new circumstances." There was something faintly mocking in his tone that set Edmund's teeth on edge. "Mr. Carstairs, to what do I owe this visit?" Carstairs produced a leather portfolio from his bag, extracting several documents. "I'll be direct, Lord Ashford. Your financial situation remains precarious. The purchase of this estate depleted what little remained of your assets. You have outstanding debts of considerable magnitude, and your creditors are growing impatient." "I'm aware of my obligations," Edmund replied stiffly. "Then you'll understand why I'm here." Carstairs laid the documents on the desk. "These are legal notices, sir. Your creditors are prepared to seek judicial remedies if payment is not forthcoming within 30 days. Given that you have no income and no prospect of generating one, this presents certain difficulties." Edmund scanned the documents, his stomach tightening. The amounts were staggering, far more than he'd realized. The bankruptcy proceedings had been complex, and apparently some debts had survived the process. "However," Carstairs continued, his tone becoming more conciliatory, "I'm prepared to offer a solution. My bank would be willing to purchase Thornfield Manor from you at a generous price, enough to settle your debts and leave you with a modest sum to establish yourself elsewhere. You could start fresh, Lord Ashford, unburden yourself from this failing estate and the weight of your family's misfortunes." Edmund looked up sharply. "You want to buy Thornfield?" "The land has potential," Carstairs said smoothly. "With proper investment, it could be developed profitably. I have clients interested in such ventures, and frankly, you're in no position to refuse. 30 days, Lord Ashford. After that, the courts will seize the property anyway, and you'll receive nothing." "This estate has been in my family for 300 years, Edmund said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "It's not some commodity to be bought and sold at convenience." Carstairs' smile was thin and humorless. "Sentiment is a luxury you can no longer afford. I'll leave these documents with you. Consider my offer carefully. It's the only reasonable course of action available to you." After Carstairs departed, Edmund sat alone in the library, the legal notices spread before him. The words blurred as he read them again. Judgment, seizure, auction, his last connection to his family's heritage, to the legacy his grandfather had struggled to preserve, threatened to slip through his fingers. He reached for the pocket watch, finding comfort in its familiar weight. Then he remembered the locket and the cipher notebook in his coat. He retrieved them, laying them beside the legal documents. Here was the paradox of his situation. He stood on the threshold of uncovering his family's greatest secrets, yet might lose everything before the mystery could be solved. A knock at the door interrupted his dark thoughts. Thomas Webb entered, his weathered face showing concern. "Begging your pardon, sir, but I couldn't help overhearing some of that conversation. The banker was speaking loudly enough to wake the dead. He wants to buy Thornfield," Edmund said wearily. "And I'm in no position to refuse him." Webb sat down uninvited, a breach of protocol that spoke to the gravity of the situation. "Sir, there's something about Carstairs you should know. My father told me stories about his family. The Carstairs and the Ashfords were rivals going back generations. Not just business rivals, but something deeper. There was bad blood between the families, though the reason for it has been forgotten. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that his interest in Thornfield might not be purely financial. There's something here he wants, and it's not just the land." Webb gestured toward the window, beyond which the grounds stretched into darkness. "He's been asking questions in the village. Questions about the manor's history, about old tunnels and passages." "He knows something, sir." Edmund felt a chill run down his spine. "How long has he been asking these questions?" "Years, according to the Reverend. Long before you arrived, long before the estate came up for sale." Webb leaned forward. "Whatever is hidden beneath this manor, Carstairs has been searching for it. And now he sees his chance to take it from you legally." Edmund looked down at the legal notices with new understanding. This wasn't simply about collecting debts or acquiring property. Carstairs was trying to force him out before Edmund could discover what his ancestors had hidden. 30 days, Edmund said slowly. "He gave me 30 days. "Then we have 30 days to find whatever is down there," Webb replied grimly. 30 days to prove that Thornfield is worth more than any debt." After Webb departed, Edmund remained in the library, studying the cipher notebook by lamplight. The symbols danced before his tired eyes, refusing to yield their meaning. He needed help, someone with expertise in such matters. But who could he trust? The local reverend had been helpful, but deciphering complex codes likely exceeded his abilities. A thought struck him. The letter he'd received months ago, just before his bankruptcy became public. It had been from a London antiquarian, offering condolences and assistance should he ever need expert evaluation of family heirlooms. At the time, Edmund had dismissed it as vulture behavior, someone hoping to profit from his misfortune. But now he wondered. He searched through his correspondence until he found it. Miss Victoria Hartley, specialist in Georgian and Regency period artifacts and documents. Her letter had been professional and sympathetic, with no hint of opportunism. Perhaps she could help with the cipher. Edmund pulled out writing paper and began composing a letter. He chose his words carefully, revealing enough to pique interest, but not so much as to expose the full extent of his discovery. He needed help, but he needed to be cautious about who he brought into this deepening mystery. As he sealed the letter, ready to post it in the morning, he heard it again. The footsteps overhead, that slow, deliberate pace. But tonight they seemed different, more urgent somehow. And when they stopped, instead of the usual dragging sound, he heard something else. A series of regular thumps, like someone knocking on hollow wood. Edmund looked up at the ceiling, his earlier exhaustion forgotten. The manor was trying to tell him something. He was certain of it now. The sounds, the hidden passages, the cipher notebooks, all pieces of a puzzle that someone desperately wanted solved, and someone else desperately wanted to remain hidden. He gathered the locket, the cipher notebook, and the legal documents together. 30 days. He would need every hour of that time to uncover the truth before Carstairs could take Thornfield from him. The clock was ticking, and somewhere beneath his feet the answers waited in darkness. The following days passed in a blur of exploration and documentation. Edmund and Webb ventured deeper into the underground network, carefully mapping each passage and chamber. The scale of the construction continued to astound them. These weren't simple smuggler tunnels hastily carved from earth. They were engineering marvels, stone-lined passages built to last centuries. On the 4th day of exploration, they discovered a chamber they'd somehow missed in their initial survey. It lay behind what appeared to be a solid wall in one of the main corridors. Edmund had been examining the stonework, noting how certain blocks bore different weathering patterns. When his hand pressed against a particular stone and felt it give slightly, "Webb, bring the lantern closer," Edmund called. The groundskeeper moved forward, holding the light high. In its glow, they could now see that this wasn't a solid wall at all, but a cleverly constructed door designed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding masonry. The stone Edmund had pressed must have released some internal mechanism, because now a thin crack showed where none had been visible before. Together they pushed, and the entire section swung inward on hidden hinges, so well balanced that the heavy stone door moved with almost no resistance. Beyond lay a room unlike any they'd yet discovered. This chamber was larger, perhaps 30 feet square, and the ceiling was higher, supported by carved pillars. The walls bore faded murals depicting ships at sea, battles, and what appeared to be ceremonial gatherings. But it was the contents of the room that made Edmund's pulse quicken. Wooden crates were stacked along one wall, most rotted and collapsed, but a few still intact. A massive table dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with the remains of what might have been maps, though the paper had long since deteriorated to fragments. And in a locked cabinet against the far wall, Edmund found what he was searching for. The cabinet's lock yielded to the master key, and inside were shelves lined with leather-bound books and metal boxes. Edmund lifted one of the books carefully, opening it to reveal page after page of meticulous entries. This was no cipher. This was a ledger, similar to the one he'd found in the library, but far more detailed. "Shipments received," he read aloud. "Gold sovereigns, £2,000 sterling. Silver plate, 480 ounces. Jewels, various estimated value £5,000. Delivered to Vault 3. Smuggling, then," Webb said, his voice holding disappointment. "Your ancestors were common smugglers." But Edmund shook his head, continuing to read. "Look at the dates. January 1794, May 1795. These correspond with the height of the French Revolution. And look here at these notations. Payment for services rendered to the Crown. Authorization, Lord Hawthorne." "That's not smuggling, Webb. That's government work." He pulled down another ledger, then another. They all told the same story. Lord Charles Ashford had been running a secret operation, moving valuables and apparently people as well through these underground passages. The entries spoke of refugees sheltered, intelligence gathered, payments made to unnamed agents. In one of the metal boxes, Edmund found correspondence that confirmed his suspicions. Letters bearing official seals, written in careful language that nonetheless made their purpose clear. His ancestor had been operating a covert network during the wars with France, working directly for the Crown, but maintaining absolute secrecy about his activities. "This explains everything," Edmund breathed. "The mysterious decline in family fortunes, the scandal that no one would speak of openly. My ancestor wasn't stealing from the Crown, he was working for it." But something went wrong. The final box contained personal correspondence, and here the story became tragic. Letters from Lord Charles to various government officials pleading for recognition of his service. Letters demanding payment for expenses incurred. And finally, bitter letters written after the war ended. When Charles realized that the government had no intention of acknowledging his work or compensating his considerable financial losses. He bankrupted himself serving his country, Edmund said quietly, holding one particularly painful letter. And they let him take the blame for it. But it was the last item in the box that truly captured Edmund's attention. The silver locket he'd found earlier had a twin, a matching piece on a slightly heavier chain. Inside was another portrait, this time of Lord Charles himself, painted in the prime of his life. But it was what was inscribed on the opposite face that made Edmund's hands shake. The inscription wasn't in English, but in a series of symbols similar to those in the cipher notebook. However, unlike the notebook's complex sequences, this was clearly meant to be read by someone who knew the key. The symbols were arranged in groups, with spacing that suggested words and sentences. Edmund pulled the cipher notebook from his coat and laid it beside the locket, comparing the symbols. They matched. This locket was meant to be read in conjunction with the notebook. They were pieces of the same puzzle. "We need that antiquarian," Edmund said, securing both lockets carefully in his inside pocket. "Miss Hartley. She might be able to help us decode this." They continued their exploration, finding more evidence of the operation's scope. Chamber after chamber revealed caches of supplies, documents, and personal effects. In one room, they discovered military uniforms from various European nations, clearly meant for disguise. In another, tools for forgery, printing presses, seal makers, samples of official papers. "Your ancestor was running a sophisticated intelligence operation," Webb observed. "This goes far beyond simple smuggling or even sheltering refugees." Edmund nodded, but his mind was racing ahead. If Lord Charles had truly bankrupted himself in service to the Crown, and if he'd hidden evidence of that service here at Thornfield, then there must be something more. Some proof that could vindicate the family name and perhaps explain the mysterious burden his grandfather had spoken of. As they prepared to leave the chamber, Edmund noticed something he'd initially overlooked. High on one wall, partially hidden by shadow, was a plaque bearing the Ashford crest and an inscription in Latin. He held up the lantern, translating slowly, "What nation owes, nation denies. What honor demands, necessity conceals. Here lies the truth that virtue guards and time shall reveal." Webb frowned. "Sounds like your ancestor knew he'd been betrayed." "More than that," Edmund said. "He knew that someday someone from the family would find this place. This isn't just a hiding spot. It's a testament, evidence preserved for the day when the truth could finally be told." They emerged from the underground passages as dusk was falling, their lanterns dim and their bodies weary. But Edmund felt energized by their discoveries. Somewhere in these chambers, possibly in the cipher that the lockets and notebook contained, was proof of his family's service and sacrifice. Proof that might not only clear the Ashford name, but also secure the estate's future. Mrs. Dalton met them at the entrance, her face showing relief. "Lord Ashford." A letter arrived by express post. From London, Edmund's heart leaped as he saw the return address. Victoria Hartley had responded far more quickly than he'd expected. He tore open the envelope, reading rapidly. She agreed to come. More than that, she expressed keen interest in the artifacts he'd described and promised to arrive within 3 days. She specialized in Georgian-era cryptography and had worked with the British Museum on similar projects. If anyone could decode his ancestor's cipher, it would be her. Edmund looked down at the locket in his hand, feeling its weight, its promise. 26 days remained until Carstairs' deadline. But now, for the first time since arriving at Thornfield, Edmund felt genuine hope. The answers were within reach, if only he could decipher them before time ran out. Victoria Hartley arrived on a grey Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after her letter, precisely as promised. Edmund watched from the library window as the hired carriage navigated the rutted drive, noting the efficiency with which she organized her arrival. 2 sturdy traveling cases and a leather portfolio case suggested someone prepared for serious work. She stepped down from the carriage with the confidence of a woman accustomed to travel. Perhaps 30 years of age, she wore a practical traveling suit in dark green, her auburn hair arranged in a simple but elegant style. Her face held intelligence and determination, softened by what appeared to be genuine curiosity as she surveyed Thornfield's Gothic facade. Edmund met her at the entrance, Jasper at his side. The dog's tail wagged approvingly as Victoria bent to greet him first, a gesture that immediately raised her in Edmund's estimation. "Lord Ashford," she said, straightening and offering her hand in the modern fashion. Her grip was firm. "Thank you for trusting me with your family's mystery. Your letter was tantalizingly vague, which only increased my interest, Miss Hartley. I hope the journey wasn't too arduous. I've endured far worse in pursuit of historical truth." Her eyes swept the entrance hall, taking in the water-stained plaster and faded grandeur with professional assessment. "Your home has remarkable bones, Georgian architecture at its finest, despite the obvious neglect." Mrs. Dalton appeared to show Victoria to her rooms, but the antiquarian requested permission to see the artifacts first. "Professional curiosity," she explained with a slight smile. "I've been thinking about nothing else for 3 days." Edmund led her to the library, where he'd arranged the items on the desk, the twin lockets, the cipher notebook, the architectural plans, and the builder's journal. Victoria approached slowly, reverently, her expression transforming from professional interest to genuine excitement. "May I?" she asked, reaching for the first locket. Edmund nodded, watching as she examined it with practiced care. She produced a magnifying glass from her coat pocket, studying the craftsmanship and the cipher symbols etched inside. "Exquisite work," she murmured. "Late 18th century, I'd estimate around 1790 to 1795. The cipher is period appropriate, a variation of the visionaire method if I'm not mistaken. See here how certain symbols repeat at regular intervals. That suggests a keyword cipher. Can you decode it?" Edmund asked, unable to contain his eagerness. Victoria's smile was patient. "Given time and the proper resources, yes. But first, I need context. Your letter mentioned underground passages and evidence of your ancestors' service to the crown. I need to understand everything you've discovered before attempting the cipher. A code like this was designed to be understood only by someone with specific knowledge." Over the next hour, Edmund recounted the entire story. His grandfather's cryptic warnings, the discovery of the passages, the evidence of Lord Charles's covert operations, the financial ruin that followed his service. Victoria listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions or making notes in a small, leather-bound journal she carried. When he finished, she sat back, her expression thoughtful. "This is far more significant than I initially imagined. If what you're telling me is true, if you have genuine evidence of Crown-sanctioned intelligence operations during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic period, this could rewrite portions of that era's history. But will it save my estate?" Edmund asked bluntly. "I have less than 4 weeks before my creditors force a sale." Victoria's gaze was steady and sympathetic. "That depends on what the cipher reveals. If your ancestor documented crown debts owed to your family, if there's official acknowledgement of his service and the expenses incurred, then yes, you might have legal grounds for restitution. The crown is careful about its obligations, even those kept secret for decades." She reached for the cipher notebook, flipping through its pages carefully. "This is systematic documentation. Look at the date entries, the careful structure. Your ancestor was creating a record that could be understood by future generations if they possessed the key." She glanced at Edmund. "Do you have any family records that might contain that key? Letters, diaries, anything from Lord Charles's period?" Edmund shook his head. "The library was picked clean decades ago. The family ledger I found contains only financial records, and most of those are heavily water-damaged." "Then we work with what we have." Victoria pulled a sheaf of papers from her portfolio. I brought copies of known 18th century ciphers used by the British government during that period. We'll start by attempting standard decryption methods and adjust from there. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, barely pausing for the dinner Mrs. Dalton brought them. Victoria approached the cipher methodically, testing different decryption keys against the symbols. Edmund assisted where he could, mostly reading aloud the architectural plans and builder's journal, hoping for some clue that might aid the decryption. It was nearly midnight when Victoria made her first breakthrough. She'd been working with the inscriptions on both lockets when she suddenly straightened, her eyes bright with discovery. "The lockets themselves," she said excitedly. "They're not just containers for the portraits. Look at the symbols inside each one. They're different, but complementary. One contains the cipher key, the other the method of application." She pulled out fresh paper and began working rapidly, translating symbols into letters. Edmund watched, fascinated, as her pencil moved across the page with increasing confidence. "For those who follow," she read slowly, "know that honor does not fade though names be tarnished. What was taken in service shall be reclaimed in justice. Seek the vault where serpents sleep, beneath the stone where water weeps. There lies the proof that time preserves, the debt the crown can never reverse." Edmund felt his heart pounding. The vault where serpents sleep. The iron ring from the door. It was wrought in the shape of serpents, and water weeps? Victoria prompted. "There's a section of the east wall where water seeps through continuously. We've seen it in our explorations, but haven't investigated that specific area thoroughly." Edmund stood abruptly. "We need to search that section immediately." Victoria caught his arm. "Lord Ashford, Edmund, it's nearly midnight. The passages are dangerous enough in daylight. We search tomorrow, with proper preparation and witnesses present. If we've waited over a century for these answers, we can wait one more night." She was right, of course, though Edmund's impatience made the logical course of action feel like torture. They agreed to begin at first light, with Webb and Reverend Blackwood as witnesses to any discoveries. As Victoria prepared to retire to her rooms, she paused at the library door. "What you've discovered here is remarkable. Regardless of what tomorrow brings, you should be proud. Your family's true legacy isn't the manor or the fortune. It's the sacrifice they made for principles they believed in." After she'd gone, Edmund remained in the library, staring at the decoded message. The vault where serpents sleep. Tomorrow they would find it, and with it, perhaps, the salvation of everything his ancestors had worked to preserve. He touched the lockets one final time, feeling the connection to his great-great-grandfather across the span of years. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and somewhere deep within the house, those familiar footsteps began their nightly parade. But tonight, Edmund felt no fear. The manor was guiding him, just as his grandfather had hoped it would. The burden was finally being lifted, secret by secret, revelation by revelation. Dawn found Edmund, Victoria, Webb, and Reverend Blackwood assembled at the underground entrance. They'd brought additional lanterns, tools, and equipment for whatever they might find. The morning air was crisp, promising rain before afternoon, and Edmund felt the weight of anticipation pressing against his chest. "The seeping wall is in the south passage," Edmund explained, leading them down the now familiar stone steps. "We noted it during our initial mapping, but didn't investigate thoroughly. The water damage seemed natural, not structural. Their lanterns cast dancing shadows on the passage walls as they moved deeper into the network. The Reverend moved slowly, his age showing in the careful placement of each step, but his eyes were alert and curious. This was his first venture into the passages, and Edmund could see him mentally cataloguing every detail. They reached the south passage after 20 minutes of steady walking. Here the air felt damper, and Edmund could hear the constant drip of water even before they arrived at the section in question. The wall wept indeed. Water seeped through the mortar between stones, creating mineral deposits that streaked the surface with rust and white crystalline formations. "Where serpents sleep," Victoria murmured, running her hand along the wet stone. The clue was specific. We need to look for serpent imagery. They searched methodically, examining every stone, every carved detail. Webb found it first, his fingers tracing a pattern worn nearly smooth by water and time. Low on the wall, perhaps 3 feet from the floor, a stone bore the faint outline of 2 intertwined serpents. "Here," he called. "Same design as the iron ring." Edmund knelt beside him, pressing his hand against the stone. It was solid, showing no give. He tried pushing, pulling, twisting, but nothing moved. Victoria joined them, her magnifying glass in hand, studying the worn carving. "Look at their eyes," she said. "One serpent has eyes that are slightly recessed. The other's eyes protrude slightly." Edmund examined them more closely. She was right. The differences were subtle but deliberate. He pressed his thumb against one of the recessed eyes and felt it sink inward with a soft click. Then he pressed the protruding eye, and it too gave way. A grinding sound echoed through the passage, stone moving against stone. The section of wall bearing the serpent carving began to slide inward, revealing a narrow opening behind it. Cold air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of earth and something else, something metallic. "Carefully now," Blackwood cautioned. "Whatever is beyond has been sealed for over a century." Edmund led the way through the opening, his lantern held high. The passage beyond was short, perhaps 15 feet, ending in a circular chamber no more than 10 feet across. But what it contained made everyone draw sharp breaths of astonishment. The chamber's walls were lined with wooden shelves, and upon those shelves lay object after object of obvious value. Gold candlesticks, silver plate, jeweled boxes, ancient scrolls sealed in oilskin. But it was what hung on the far wall that truly captured their attention. A large map, drawn on treated leather that had survived the damp far better than paper would have. It showed the entire southern coast of England, with intricate notations marked in the cipher Edmund now recognized. Lines crisscrossed the map, connecting coastal points to inland locations. One of those lines led directly to Thornfield. "It's a network," Victoria breathed. An entire smuggling and intelligence network mapped in detail, but Webb had moved to examine the shelves more closely. "So look at these markings on the boxes." Each wooden box bore a metal plate with engraved text. Edmund read them aloud, "Property of His Majesty's government. Contents, intelligence dispatches, channel operations. Authorization Lord Hawthorne." Another read, "Crown property. Payment owing for services rendered. Value £15,000 sterling. Your ancestor didn't just work for the Crown," Blackwood said quietly. "He financed their operations with his own money, expecting reimbursement that never came." Victoria was examining one of the scrolls, carefully unrolling it despite its fragility. "This is a letter from the Foreign Secretary, dated March 1796. It explicitly promises reimbursement for expenses incurred in Crown service, with specific amounts detailed." She looked up at Edmund, her eyes bright. "This is it. This is the proof you need." They spent the next 2 hours cataloguing everything in the chamber. Victoria took detailed notes, while Webb carefully transported the most valuable documents back to the manor's library. Edmund found himself repeatedly drawn to the map, studying the network his ancestor had created. "It's remarkable," he said to Victoria as they worked side by side. "He built something that lasted beyond the wars, beyond his own lifetime. This wasn't just about money or service. It was about creating something permanent." She nodded, her fingers tracing one of the routes on the map. "And in doing so, he ensured the truth would survive. Even when the government denied him, even when his family was ruined, the evidence remained." She paused. "Edmund, this map shows more than just historical roots. Some of these notations reference ongoing operations. If I'm reading the dates correctly, this network remained active well into the 1820s. 30 years after the French wars ended," Edmund said slowly. "What were they using it for?" Before Victoria could answer, Webb called from the passage entrance. "So you need to see this. There's another chamber beyond this one. The smuggler's map shows it." Edmund hurried over. Webb had found a second concealed door, similar to the first but smaller. Beyond it lay a passage that sloped downward sharply, deeper into the earth than any they'd yet explored. According to the map, Webb said, this passage connects to the old well near the south boundary. It's marked as primary route with special notations in the cipher. How long would it take to reach the well through this passage? Edmund asked. On the surface, the well is perhaps half a mile distant. Underground, with this slope possibly longer, Reverend Blackwood had joined them, studying the passage with concern. That well has been dry for as long as I can remember. But my father told me stories about it. Said there were rumors during the wars that it was used for smuggling French goods. Though why they'd smuggle inland from a dry well, I never understood. Because it wasn't about smuggling goods into England, Victoria said, realization dawning in her voice. It was about moving people and information out. The network didn't just operate during the French wars. It was part of the intelligence apparatus for decades afterward. Edmund felt the pieces clicking into place. His family hadn't just served the crown during one conflict. They'd maintained a crucial intelligence network through multiple governments and multiple conflicts. And when the government decided they were no longer needed, when the expense became inconvenient, they'd simply abandoned the Ashfords to financial ruin. We need to explore the full extent of the network, Edmund said decisively. Every passage, every chamber. If there's more evidence like this, I want it documented and preserved. They emerged from the underground as promised rain began to fall. Mrs. Dalton met them at the entrance, her face showing both relief and curiosity at the collection of artifacts they carried. There's been a visitor while you were below, sir, she said to Edmund. Mr. Carstairs came by. He seemed quite agitated when I told him you were unavailable. Said he'd return tomorrow with papers that required your immediate attention. Edmund exchanged glances with Victoria. Carstairs' timing was suspicious. 3 weeks remained until his deadline, yet he was pressing harder now. He's worried, Victoria said quietly. Someone has told him we're making progress. He knows we're finding things. Then we work faster, Edmund replied. Webb, organize everything we brought up today in the library. Miss Hartley, if you could continue documenting and translating. Reverend, I'd appreciate if you could research any church records that might corroborate what we're finding. As they dispersed to their tasks, Edmund stood in the rain for a moment, letting it wash away the underground's dust and darkness. Above him, Thornfield Manor loomed against the grey sky, no longer a symbol of defeat, but a fortress protecting secrets worth more than gold. He touched the map case in his coat, feeling its weight. The smuggler's map, the key to understanding everything. News travelled quickly through Millbrook. Within days of their discoveries, whispers began circulating through the village. Edmund heard them at the market, in casual conversations that stopped when he approached, but resumed in lowered voices once he'd passed. The Ashford name, so long associated with scandal and decline, was being spoken with new curiosity, even tentative respect. The shift became tangible on Sunday morning, when Edmund attended services at the village church. He'd gone every week since his arrival, sitting alone in the Ashford family pew. The decades of absence had left dusty and neglected. But this Sunday, as he entered, several villagers nodded in greeting, rather than looking away. Old Mrs. Pemberton, who'd pointedly ignored him since his arrival, offered a small smile. Reverend Blackwood's sermon seemed directed specifically at Edmund, though perhaps that was his imagination. The Reverend spoke of perseverance in the face of doubt, of truths revealed through patient searching, of legacies preserved through faithful stewardship. His eyes found Edmund several times during the service. After the benediction, as Edmund made his way toward the exit, a hand touched his elbow. He turned to find Mr. Whitmore, the innkeeper from the Ploughman's Rest. Lord Ashford, if you have a moment, Whitmore said, his voice carrying none of its previous skepticism. There are several of us who'd like a word. Edmund followed him to the church vestry, where a small group had assembled. He recognized most of them, local tradesmen, farmers, the village schoolteacher. They looked uncomfortable but determined. We've been talking, Whitmore began, clearing his throat, about the old days when your family ran things proper like... My grandfather worked the Thornfield farms. Said it was the best employment he ever had. Fair wages, decent treatment. Nothing like what came after. An elderly man stepped forward, leaning heavily on a walking stick. "I'm Charles Pemberton, sir. My father was head carpenter at the manor during your great-grandfather's time. He kept records, he did. Detailed accounts of all the special work he'd done on the property." Edmund's pulse quickened. "What kind of special work?" "Underground construction, sir. Secret like. My father never spoke of it much, said he'd been sworn to silence. But he kept his records all the same, in case questions were ever asked." Pemberton produced a leather document case, its surface cracked with age. "Found these when we were clearing out the old house. Thought you might want them." Inside were architectural drawings and work orders, yellowed with age, but remarkably well preserved. Edmund recognized several of the underground chambers he'd already explored, but these plans showed construction details and dates he hadn't known. More importantly, they showed chambers he hadn't yet discovered. "This is invaluable," Edmund said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." The schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Catherine Hartwell, spoke up. "We've also been researching the old records at the school, Lord Ashford. Your family established the village school in 1798, funded it entirely for over 40 years. The building still stands, though it's in need of repair. We found the original deed in our archives." She handed him a document bearing his great-great-grandfather's seal. Edmund read it with growing wonder. The deed established not just a school, but a charitable foundation, funded in perpetuity by Ashford family resources. The foundation was meant to provide education, medical care and assistance to the needy in Millbrook and surrounding villages. "Why hasn't this been in operation?" Edmund asked. "Because the funding dried up, sir," Whitmore explained. "When your family's fortunes declined, the foundation couldn't continue, but the legal structure still exists. If proper funding were restored, it could operate again." Edmund looked at the faces around him, seeing hope where once had been only mockery or pity. These people had lived their entire lives knowing that something valuable had been lost when the Ashfords fell. Now they saw a possibility of restoration, not just of the manor, but of the community structures his ancestors had built. "I can't make promises yet," Edmund said carefully. "My own situation remains precarious. But if I can prove my family's claims, if I can secure what's owed to us, restoring this foundation will be my first priority." The group dispersed with handshakes and renewed goodwill. Edmund remained in the vestry with Reverend Blackwood, studying the carpenter's records and the foundation deed. "You're being careful with your words," Blackwood observed. "You could have promised them anything. They'd have believed you." "My family's decline came partly from empty promises," Edmund replied. "I won't continue that tradition. But these documents, Reverend, they prove my ancestor was building something meant to last. The underground passages weren't just for war work. They were part of a larger vision for community security and prosperity." That afternoon, Edmund hosted an impromptu gathering at the manor. Webb's grandson, young Thomas, had recovered from his illness, and Webb brought him to meet Edmund. The boy was perhaps 7, bright-eyed and curious despite his obvious weakness. "My grandson thanks you, sir," Webb said, his voice rough with emotion. "The medicines you provided, the London doctor's consultation. You didn't have to do that. Every child deserves a chance at health," Edmund replied, ruffling the boy's hair. "Your grandfather's service to Thornfield earned more than wages. It earned gratitude. Victoria had been working in the library all morning, but she emerged when she heard voices. She'd been translating more of the cipher documents, and her expression suggested important discoveries. "Edmund, I've found something you need to see," she said, then noticed young Thomas. Her face softened immediately. "But first, who is this young man?" "This is Thomas Webb, Miss Hartley," Edmund introduced. "Thomas, this is a friend who's helping us solve some family mysteries." The boy regarded Victoria with solemn curiosity. "Are you going to marry Lord Ashford?" he asked with childhood directness. Both Edmund and Victoria startled, then laughed. "We're colleagues, young man," Victoria said, though Edmund noticed the faint colour in her cheeks. Sometimes friendship is the best foundation for solving mysteries. After Webb and his grandson departed, Victoria led Edmund back to the library. Spread across the desk were several documents she'd translated, along with the charitable foundation deed the villagers had provided. Your ancestor didn't just create an intelligence network, Victoria explained. He used it to establish what he called resilient community structures. Look at these entries. Regular payments to maintain schools, workshops for teaching trades, emergency funds for villagers in need. He was building a self-sustaining community that could weather political and economic storms. And when the government abandoned him financially, the entire structure collapsed, Edmund said. Understanding flooding through him. Exactly. The foundation deed you received today is the key document. If you can prove the Crown owes your family compensation for services rendered, those funds could legally be directed toward restoring the foundation. It's not just about saving Thornfield. It's about reviving everything your ancestor tried to build. Edmund sat down heavily, the weight of revelation pressing on him. His pursuit of family vindication had seemed almost selfish, a desperate attempt to salvage personal pride and property. But now he understood that it meant so much more. Entire generations of Millbrook residents had suffered when the Ashford Foundation collapsed. Restoring it would repair damage that extended far beyond one family's fortunes. That evening, as Edmund walked the manor grounds with Jasper, he found himself viewing everything differently. The crumbling walls weren't just family shame. They represented a community's lost stability. The overgrown gardens weren't merely neglect. They were the visible symbol of broken promises that his ancestors had been forced to abandon. He paused near the entrance to the underground passages, now partially cleared and secured. Somewhere below lay the complete documentation of his family's service and sacrifice, and with it, perhaps, the means to restore not just the Ashford name, but the entire community structure Lord Charles had envisioned. Carstairs' deadline still loomed, now just 18 days away. But Edmund felt the momentum shifting. The community was rallying behind him. The evidence was mounting, and most importantly, he finally understood what was truly at stake. Victoria worked through the night, fueled by strong tea and the thrill of discovery. Edmund found her in the library at dawn, surrounded by papers and open books, her hair escaping its pins, ink staining her fingers. But her eyes blazed with triumph. "I've done it," she said before Edmund could speak. "I've fully decoded the primary cipher. Edmund, what your ancestor documented is extraordinary." She pushed several pages toward him, her handwriting covering them in neat columns. "The Locket cipher was just the beginning. Once I understood the base methodology, the entire notebook opened up. It's all here, every operation, every expense, every promise made by Crown officials." Edmund sat beside her, scanning the translations. Page after page, detailed covert operations. Agents moved through France and Spain. Intelligence gathered and delivered to London. Refugees extracted from dangerous situations. Each entry concluded with careful accounting of expenses and the corresponding authorization codes. "Look at this sequence," Victoria said, pointing to a particular section. December 1794 through March 1795. Your ancestor moved 43 French aristocrats through his network, sheltering them until passage to America could be arranged. The Crown authorized payment of £50 per person. That's over £2,000 that should have been reimbursed. "Was it ever paid?" Edmund asked, though he already knew the answer. "Not according to these records. None of it was paid. Look at the running total at the end of each year." She flipped to a summary page. By 1800, the Crown owed your family almost £47,000. By 1810, when the operations finally ceased, the debt exceeded £65,000. Edmund's hands shook slightly as he held the translated documents. That sum, properly invested over the intervening decades, would represent a fortune today. More than enough to restore Thornfield, revive the charitable foundation, and secure his family's future for generations. But there's more. Victoria continued, pulling out a particular document from the bottom of the stack. This is the crucial piece, a royal patent issued in 1793, granting your great-great-grandfather rights to unclaimed Crown Treasury funds in recognition of his service. The document itself had been sealed in oilskin and preserved in one of the metal boxes they'd recovered. Victoria had spent hours carefully treating the paper to make it readable again. Now Edmund could see the official seal, the elaborate calligraphy, the signature of King George III himself. "Let me read the relevant passage," Victoria said, her voice steady but excited. "Lord Charles Ashford of Thornfield Manor is hereby granted perpetual claim to such Crown funds as may be recovered through his agency, and furthermore to compensation for expenses incurred in service to the realm, said compensation to be held in trust until such time as public acknowledgment may be safely made." "In trust," Edmund repeated, meaning the government acknowledged the debt but delayed payment. Indefinitely, as it turns out. But Edmund, this changes everything. This isn't about convincing the current government to pay for services rendered over a century ago. This is about enforcing an existing legal obligation that was never fulfilled. The Crown cannot deny what their own king signed into law. Edmund stood and walked to the window, watching dawn light transform the grounds from shadow to substance. His mind raced with implications. This wasn't just vindication, it was justice, delayed but finally within reach. "There's something else you need to understand," Victoria said, joining him at the window. "I've been researching Crown Treasury practices from that period. When debts couldn't be paid immediately, they were often secured against future revenue streams. I believe your ancestors' compensation might still exist, somewhere in the Treasury's accounting, waiting to be claimed." "After all this time? How? Is that possible?" "Because the Crown's bookkeeping is meticulous and its memory is long. Debts don't simply disappear. They're transferred, reassigned, but always accounted for. If we can present this royal patent to the proper authorities, along with the supporting documentation of services rendered, we can demand an audit of historical treasury obligations to the Ashford family." Edmund felt hope surge through him, stronger than any he'd experienced since arriving at Thornfield. How long would such an audit take? Weeks at minimum, possibly months. But Edmund, you only have 18 days before Carstairs can force the sale of the estate. The hope dimmed slightly. So we're still racing against time, which is why we need to take a different approach. Victoria's expression became thoughtful. "We don't wait for the Treasury to complete its audit. We present the royal patent and demand an immediate injunction preventing any sale of the property until the matter is resolved. The courts cannot allow a debt-disputed property to be sold. It would compromise any eventual settlement. You're suggesting I sue the Crown. I'm suggesting you enforce a contract the Crown itself created. There's a difference." Victoria pulled a thick book from the shelf, one of the legal texts she'd brought from London. "I studied law before specializing in antiquarian work. This situation, while unusual, has legal precedent. The Crown has been compelled before to honor old debts when presented with undeniable documentation." They spent the morning preparing their case. Victoria organized the translated documents chronologically, creating a clear narrative of Lord Charles's service and the corresponding Crown obligations. Edmund reviewed the architectural plans and chamber contents, noting every piece of physical evidence that corroborated the written records. By afternoon, they had compiled a formidable dossier. The royal patent formed its centerpiece, surrounded by layers of supporting documentation. Bills of expense, authorization codes, correspondence from Crown officials, and the careful accounting. Records that Lord Charles had maintained despite his government's betrayal. "We need to take this to London," Edmund said finally. "Present it directly to the Treasury's legal department." And quickly, Victoria agreed. But Edmund, there's something else we should consider. Carstairs. His interest in Thornfield, his pressure to force a sale. What if he knows about these documents? What if that's what he's really been searching for all these years? The thought had occurred to Edmund, but hearing Victoria voice it made the danger more immediate. If he knows or even suspects, he might try to prevent us from reaching London. Then we move discreetly. Tomorrow, just you and me, we'll take the documents to my solicitor in London. He has connections within the Treasury. And we'll file the injunction immediately. Mrs. Dalton knocked and entered with afternoon tea. Her face showed concern at their obvious tension. "Is everything well, sir? You both look as though you've been working yourselves to exhaustion." "We've had a breakthrough, Mrs. Dalton," Edmund said, accepting the tea gratefully. "Miss Hartley has decoded documents that may change everything. But we need to act quickly and carefully." The housekeeper's expression grew stern. "Then you should know, sir, Mr. Carstairs was back this morning early before you'd risen. He spoke with Thomas Webb in the yard. I couldn't hear what was said, but Webb looked troubled after." Edmund and Victoria exchanged glances. "Send Webb to me, please," Edmund requested. When the groundskeeper arrived minutes later, his discomfort was obvious. "Sir, I should have come to you immediately. Carstairs offered me money, a substantial sum. Said if I could bring him information about what you've been finding in the underground passages, he'd see me set for life." "And what did you tell him?" Edmund asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Told him my family has served the Ashfords for 4 generations, sir. Whatever you've found belongs to you, not to him." He wasn't pleased. Webb shifted his weight uncomfortably. "But, sir, he said something else. Said time was running short, and I'd regret choosing loyalty over sense. Made it sound like a threat." Edmund felt anger rise, but controlled it. "Thank you for telling me, Webb. Your loyalty is appreciated." After Webb departed, Edmund turned to Victoria. "We leave tonight." They planned to depart at first light, but Edmund couldn't shake the feeling that they were being observed. As he packed the documents into a secure case that evening, he found himself repeatedly glancing toward the windows, though darkness beyond the glass revealed nothing. Victoria was securing her own belongings when Edmund knocked on her door. "Something doesn't feel right," he said without preamble. "We should leave tonight now, rather than waiting for morning." She studied his face, then nodded. "Your instinct. I'll be ready." In 10 minutes, Edmund descended to the library one final time, wanting to ensure nothing crucial had been overlooked. Jasper followed, the dog's ears alert and his movements tense. Edmund had learned to trust the spaniel's instincts, and right now Jasper was telling him something was wrong. He was closing the document case when he heard it. Not the familiar nighttime footsteps from above, but something else. The crunch of gravel under boot heel from outside. He moved to the window and peered into the darkness. A flash of movement near the stable yard. Then another, closer to the house. Edmund's blood ran cold. Someone was out there, and they weren't being particularly careful about stealth. He grabbed the document case and hurried to find Webb, whose quarters were in the west wing. The groundskeeper answered his knock immediately, already dressed despite the late hour. "Couldn't sleep, sir. Something's not right. I did a circuit of the grounds an hour ago. Found boot prints near the east garden entrance. Fresh prints and not from any boots I recognize. How many men? At least 3, possibly more. They're watching the house, sir." Edmund's mind raced. If Carstairs had sent men to intercept them, the main road to London would be dangerous. They needed an alternative route, one that wouldn't be anticipated. "The underground passages," Edmund said. "The network connects to the old well near the south boundary. We could reach it through the tunnels, emerge outside the estate, and hire transport from the next village over." Webb nodded slowly. "It's risky, sir. Those southern passages we haven't fully explored. Could be unstable, riskier than staying here with hostile eyes watching our every move." Edmund countered. "Get Mrs. Dalton. Tell her to prepare provisions for 3 days' journey." and bring every lantern we have." Within 30 minutes, they'd assembled in the manor's entrance hall. Victoria carried a small travelling bag, her expression determined. Mrs. Dalton had packed food and water, her face pale with worry. Webb carried rope and tools for clearing obstacles. The longer passages could take several hours to traverse, Edmund warned. "We have no idea what condition they're in beyond the chambers we've already explored." "Better than the alternative," Victoria replied firmly. "If Carstairs is desperate enough to have men watching the house, he won't hesitate to stop us on the open road." They descended into the underground network, the now familiar stone steps leading down into earth and darkness. Edmund carried the document case securely strapped across his chest. Jasper led the way, his nose working constantly, alert for danger or instability. The initial passages were familiar territory. They moved quickly, their lanterns casting wild shadows on the stone walls. But when they reached the junction where the southern passage began its descent toward the old well, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The air grew noticeably colder. Water dripped from the ceiling in several places, and the walls showed more erosion than the sections they'd previously explored. Edmund consulted the architectural plans, noting that this portion of the network predated the others. It had been constructed earlier, perhaps during the initial establishment of the estate. The passage slopes downward for approximately half a mile, Edmund read from the plans, then levels out for another quarter-mile before ascending to the well outlet. They proceeded carefully, testing each section of floor before committing their full weight. In several places, Webb had to clear fallen stone or shore up crumbling sections with timber he carried for that purpose. The journey that should have taken 2 hours stretched to 4. It was during one of these delays, while Webb worked to stabilize a particularly treacherous section of passage, that Edmund noticed something unusual. A modern oil lantern, half hidden beneath a pile of loose stone. He picked it up carefully, examining it by their own light. "This is recent," he said, showing it to Victoria. "No more than a few days old." "Someone else has been down here," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Someone who knows about these passages." Webb had stopped his work to examine the lantern. "That's from Hayes's general store in Millbrook. I recognize the maker's mark. Only a dozen or so in the village have lanterns like this, including Carstairs." Edmund asked. "Including Carstairs, sir. The discovery changed everything. If Carstairs had been exploring the passages, he knew about the underground network. He might even know where they were heading right now." "We continue forward," Edmund decided, "but carefully. If someone is ahead of us, I want to see them before they see us." They extinguished all but one lantern, moving in near darkness to avoid alerting anyone who might be waiting ahead. Jasper's low growl was their only warning before they rounded a curve and saw it, fresh bootprints in the damp earth, leading deeper into the passage. 2 sets, Webb whispered, kneeling to examine them. "Heavy men, by the depth." And they're not being careful. "They expect to be alone down here," Edmund made a decision. "Victoria, Webb, stay here with the lanterns. I'm going ahead to scout. If I'm not back in 30 minutes, return to the manor and send for the constable." "Absolutely not," Victoria protested. "We stay together. If they catch all 3 of us, we lose everything," Edmund reasoned. "At least this way. If something happens to me, you can still reach London with the documents." Before Victoria could argue further, Jasper bolted ahead, barking furiously. Edmund had no choice but to follow, running through the darkness toward whatever his faithful companion had found. The passage opened suddenly into a small chamber, and there Edmund found the source of the bootprints. 2 men, rough-looking and clearly surprised by the intrusion. One held a sledgehammer, positioned to strike at a sealed doorway. The other reached for a cudgel as Jasper confronted them, teeth bared. "Lord Ashford," one of them said, recovering his composure. "Mr. Carstairs said you might try using the passages. He'll be pleased we found you first." Edmund's hand closed around a loose stone from the pile near his feet. "Whatever Carstairs is paying you, it's not worth the consequences of assault against a peer of the realm." The man with the cudgel laughed. "Peer of the realm. That's a laugh. Everyone knows you're bankrupt and powerless. Mr. Carstairs owns this estate in all but name. He just sent us to collect what's rightfully his. Webb and Victoria appeared behind Edmund, lanterns held high. The additional light revealed that the sealed doorway the men had been preparing to breach bore the Ashford family crest. "That chamber contains property that belongs to my family," Edmund said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "You'll leave now, or I'll have the law on you for trespassing and attempted theft." The men exchanged glances, clearly uncertain. They'd expected to work unobserved, not to confront their employer's target directly. Before they could respond, the sound of additional footsteps echoed from deeper in the passage behind them. Henry Carstairs emerged from the darkness, his face flushed with exertion or anger. He stopped short when he saw Edmund and his companions. "How convenient," Carstairs said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "I was just ensuring my future property remained secure." "These passages are dangerous, Lord Ashford. Anything could happen down here, far from witnesses." Edmund felt the weight of the document case against his chest and understood with perfect clarity what Carstairs intended. This confrontation, deep underground where no one would know what occurred, was exactly what the banker had been arranging. The standoff in the underground chamber stretched taut as a violin string. Carstairs' two hired men shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation had developed. Edmund kept his hand on Jasper's collar, restraining the dog who wanted nothing more than to defend his master. "You seem remarkably well informed about these passages," Edmund said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "One might wonder how you came by such detailed knowledge of my family's property." Carstairs' smile was cold and triumphant. "Your family's property? How quickly you forget that in 18 days, Thornfield will be mine. As for the passages, you're not the only one with access to old records. My family has been interested in this estate for generations." "Your family," Victoria interjected, her voice sharp with sudden understanding. "Not just interested, connected. There's a rivalry here that goes beyond simple business competition." Carstairs turned his attention to her, his expression shifting to something darker. "Clever girl. Yes, there's history here. My great-great-grandfather was Lord Charles Ashford's business partner. Or rather, he was supposed to be. They worked together in the early days, during the French wars, both of them running operations for the Crown, moving intelligence and contraband through southern England. Edmund felt pieces falling into place. "But something went wrong. Everything went wrong," Carstairs spat. "The Crown needed scapegoats when questions were asked about irregular activities along the coast. Your ancestor was protected because of his title and connections. Mine was not. George Carstairs was arrested, tried for smuggling and treason, and hanged at Tyburn in 1797. The family was ruined, our property seized, our name dragged through the mud, while the Ashfords maintained their respectability," Victoria said softly. "While the Ashfords kept everything," Carstairs corrected. "The network they'd built together, the wealth accumulated through their operations, the Crown's promises of payment, all of it went to Lord Charles after my ancestor's convenient death. My family has been trying to reclaim what's rightfully ours ever since." Edmund studied Carstairs with new understanding. This wasn't about debt collection or property acquisition. It was about revenge over a century old, passed down through generations like a toxic inheritance. "Your ancestor's fate was unjust," Edmund acknowledged. "But that injustice doesn't give you right to mine. Whatever arrangement existed between our families, it died with them." "Nothing dies," Carstairs replied. "Debts persist, wrongs accumulate. My family has waited 5 generations for this moment. When I learned you'd purchased Thornfield for pennies, I knew Providence had finally delivered justice. You'd bankrupt yourself trying to restore this ruin, and I'd be here to take it all when you failed. But then I started finding things," Edmund said. "The passages, the documents, the evidence of Crown debts, which is why we're here tonight," Carstairs gestured to his men. "I can't allow you to reach London with those papers. The Crown owes the Ashfords nothing. That debt was paid in full when they sacrificed my ancestor to protect their own reputation." Webb stepped forward, his weathered face set with determination. You're making threats against a lord in front of witnesses, Mr. Carstairs. That's a serious crime, regardless of your family grievances. Witnesses? Carstairs laughed. We're deep underground, miles from help. Accidents happen in old passages, cave-ins, gas pockets. Who's to say what really occurred? Edmund felt Victoria's hand touch his arm, a warning gesture. She was right to be cautious. Carstairs had moved beyond reason into something dangerous and desperate. The banker reached into his coat, and Edmund tensed, expecting a weapon. Instead, Carstairs pulled out a medallion on a heavy chain. In the lamplight, Edmund recognized the design. Two families' crests intertwined, the Ashford serpents woven through the Carstairs eagle. This was an artifact he'd never seen mentioned in any family records. Do you know what this is? Carstairs demanded. It's the partnership seal, created when our ancestors swore to work together, to share equally in risks and rewards. Your great-great-grandfather wore its twin. Where is it now, I wonder? Hidden in some chamber with the rest of the evidence of his betrayal. I've never seen anything like that, Edmund said truthfully. Of course not. Because Lord Charles destroyed his copy after he betrayed his partner. But my ancestor kept his, passing it down through generations as proof of what was stolen from us. This medallion alone proves a partnership existed, that our family has rightful claim to anything recovered from these passages. Victoria had been studying the medallion with professional interest. May I examine that? She asked, her tone carefully neutral. Carstairs held it up but didn't hand it over. Look all you want, Miss Hartley. I know you're an expert in such things. Tell me, can you dispute its authenticity? Victoria leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. Then Edmund saw something shift in her expression. Not surprise exactly, but recognition of something significant. The craftsmanship is consistent with the period, she said slowly. Late 18th century, certainly. But Mr. Carstairs, there's something you should know about partnership medallions from that era. They were created in sets of 3, not 2. 2 for the partners, and 1 held in trust by a neutral authority. Carstairs' confident expression flickered. That's nonsense. Everyone knows they came in pairs. Not for Crown-sanctioned partnerships, Victoria pressed. When the government was involved, they insisted on a 3rd medallion held by their representative. It was a security measure, ensuring neither partner could act without official knowledge. If this truly is a partnership seal involving Lord Charles Ashford, there should be a 3rd medallion somewhere in the official records. Edmund felt a surge of hope. If Victoria was right, the existence of the medallion didn't prove partnership alone. It proved Crown involvement, which would validate everything they'd found in the underground chambers. This changes nothing, Carstairs insisted, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. Even if there's a 3rd medallion, it doesn't alter the fact that my family was ruined while yours prospered. But it might alter who deserves compensation, Edmund said, understanding dawning. If your ancestor was also working for the Crown, if he was betrayed and sacrificed to protect government secrets, then his family has the same rightful claim to restitution that mine does. The silence that followed was profound. Carstairs stared at Edmund as if he'd spoken a foreign language. His hired men shifted uncomfortably, clearly out of their depth in this discussion. What are you saying? Carstairs asked finally. I'm saying we've both been pursuing the wrong goal, Edmund replied. You want revenge against my family. I want vindication for mine. But the real villain in this story isn't the Ashfords or the Carstairs. It's the Crown that used both our families and then abandoned them when convenience demanded. Victoria's hand found Edmund's again, squeezing it in support. Edmund's right. If we can prove that both families were operating under Crown authorization, if we can demonstrate that both suffered unjust losses, then we have a much stronger case for restitution. Not just for one family, but for both. Webb nodded slowly. United front is always stronger than divided forces. My father taught me that. Carstairs stood motionless, the medallion still clutched in his hand. Edmund could see the man's mind working, generations of inherited hatred warring with the practical advantage of alliance. Why should I trust you? Carstairs asked, his voice hoarse. Your family destroyed mine? No, Edmund said firmly. The crown destroyed both our families. Our ancestors were soldiers in an invisible war, and like all wars, it left casualties. But we don't have to continue fighting their battles. We can pursue justice together, or we can destroy each other trying to settle century-old scores. The choice is yours. The moment stretched, fragile as spun glass. The silence in the underground chamber stretched until Webb cleared his throat. Gentlemen, decisions made in anger rarely serve anyone well. Perhaps we should all return to the surface, have some proper food and rest, and discuss this when heads are cooler. Carstairs' shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight of generations had suddenly become too heavy to bear. He gestured to his men. Go! Tell your companions outside to stand down and leave the property. The two hired men exchanged glances, then retreated back through the passage they'd entered from. Edmund could hear their boots echoing as they hurried away, clearly relieved to escape the tense confrontation. I've been planning this for 10 years, Carstairs said quietly, almost to himself. Ever since I found the old letters in my grandfather's papers. Letters describing the partnership, the betrayal, the hanging. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't stop seeking revenge. Revenge is a poison that kills the vessel carrying it, Reverend Blackwood had once told Edmund. Standing here in the cold darkness, watching Carstairs' face, Edmund understood the truth of those words. Come back to the manor, Edmund said. If we're to work together, we need to understand the full scope of what our ancestors were involved in. There's a chamber we haven't opened yet, the sealed doorway your men were trying to breach. I believe it may hold answers for both of us. They retraced their steps through the passages, emerging into the manor's entrance hall, just as dawn light began filtering through the windows. Mrs. Dalton gasped when she saw them, filthy and exhausted, but recovered quickly and ordered hot water for washing and breakfast prepared. An hour later, cleaned and fed, they gathered in the library. Edmund spread the architectural plans across the desk, while Victoria organized the documents they'd prepared for the London journey. Carstairs sat separate from the group initially, but gradually moved closer, drawn by curiosity despite his lingering suspicion. The sealed chamber bears both family crests, Edmund explained. According to the plans, it's labeled as Primary Vault, Joint Authority Required. That suggests it was meant to be opened only when both families were present. Joint authority, Carstairs mused. So they did work together, at least initially. My grandfather wasn't simply making up stories. The question is what happened to break that partnership, Victoria said, and whether the answer lies in that sealed chamber. Webb had been studying the architectural plans. Sir, according to this, the chamber requires 2 keys working simultaneously. One key alone won't open it, one for each partner, Edmund said. We have the Ashford master key. Do you have anything similar, Carstairs? The banker hesitated, then reached into his inner coat pocket. He produced a velvet pouch and emptied its contents onto the desk. Among several items was a signet ring, its face carved with the Carstairs eagle. The band was heavy gold, and around the inside Edmund could see an inscription. My grandfather said this belonged to our ancestor, Carstairs said. He claimed it was more than just a family ring, that it held some special purpose. But we never discovered what. Victoria picked up the ring carefully, examining it with her magnifying glass. Look at the eagle's talons. They're hollow, designed to accept something. And here, on the band, these marks aren't decoration. They're instructions in code. She compared the ring to the architectural plans, then to the cipher notebook. Her eyes widened. Edmund, this is brilliant. Your ancestor left a trail. The ring isn't the key itself. It's a guide to where the key is hidden. Working through the cipher with Victoria's expert translation, they discovered that the Carstairs key had been secured in the family crypt alongside George Carstairs' body. It had been buried with him as both honor and protection, ensuring no one without legitimate claim could access the joint vault. The churchyard, Carstairs said, his voice thick with emotion. My ancestor's grave. I visited it every year as a boy, never knowing he held the key to our family's vindication. By afternoon, they'd assembled at the old cemetery where the Carstairs family vault stood. Unlike the grand Ashford tomb, with its elaborate stonework, the Carstairs vault was simple and weathered. The inscription read simply, "George Carstairs, 1752–1797, his service forgotten, his honour endures." Edmund felt profound sadness reading those words. Here lay a man whose partnership with his own ancestor should have brought both families prosperity. Instead, it had brought one man to the gallows and set two families on paths of decline and resentment. Reverend Blackwood offered prayers as they opened the vault. Inside, the coffin had long since deteriorated, but the seal had protected its contents from complete decay. With reverence and care, they searched among the remnants of burial clothes and personal effects. Webb found it first, wrapped in oilcloth and remarkably well preserved. A signet ring matching the one Carstairs carried, but this one bore the Ashford serpents and Carstairs' eagle combined, and attached to it by a thin gold chain was an iron key, wrought with the same care as the master key Edmund had found in the smithy. "He kept it with him," Carstairs said, his voice breaking slightly. "Even after the betrayal, even facing the noose, he kept the partnership key. He never broke faith." Edmund placed a hand on Carstairs' shoulder. "Then we honor that faith now. Whatever divided our families, we face the truth together." They returned to Thornfield with both keys, gathering witnesses for the opening of the joint vault. Reverend Blackwood, Mrs. Dalton, and several of the village elders who remembered stories of the old partnership. The procession descended into the underground passages, lanterns lighting their way to the sealed chamber that had waited over a century for both families to return. The doorway bore two keyholes, positioned so that both keys had to be inserted and turned simultaneously. Edmund and Carstairs stood before it, keys in hand, the moment heavy with significance. "Whatever we find in there," Edmund said, "changes everything. Are you ready?" Carstairs met his eyes, and Edmund saw something shift in the banker's expression. The hatred had receded, replaced by something approaching hope. "I'm ready." They inserted the keys together. The mechanism resisted at first, rust and time fighting against their efforts. Then, with a grinding sound that echoed through the passage, the locks released. The door swung inward on hinges that somehow still functioned after all the years. The chamber beyond was smaller than Edmund expected, but what it contained took his breath away. Shelves lined the walls, holding not gold or jewels, but documents. Thousands of pages, carefully preserved in sealed cases. And in the center of the room, on a pedestal, sat a third medallion identical to the one Carstairs wore. But it was the signet ring resting beside the medallion that truly captured everyone's attention. Larger than the individual family rings, it bore both family crests intertwined with a royal crown above them. This was the seal ring Victoria had mentioned, the official crown authority that validated everything. Victoria moved forward carefully, lifting the ring. "This isn't just a seal of partnership. This is a royal warrant. Whoever held this ring spoke with the full authority of the crown itself." Edmund picked up one of the document cases, opening it carefully. Inside were orders, signed by the king, authorizing the joint operation. Letters from ministers detailing payments owed, and most significantly, a royal decree dated 1798, 1 year after George Carstairs' execution. Edmund read aloud, his voice shaking slightly. "In recognition that George Carstairs acted under Crown authority and in service to the realm, his execution is hereby acknowledged as an injustice. His family is to receive full compensation and restoration of honor to be paid from the treasury when circumstances allow public acknowledgement." Carstairs staggered, steadied by Webb's quick hand. "It's there. It's been here all along." "My family's vindication, both families," Edmund corrected gently. "The crown owes both our families for service, sacrifice, and generations of silence. And now we have the proof to claim what's owed." The journey to London took 2 days of hard travel. Edmund and Carstairs rode together in the same carriage, Victoria between them. The document cases secured in a locked chest beneath their seat. Webb had remained at Thornfield with Reverend Blackwood, both men prepared to testify if summoned. They arrived at the Treasury offices on a grey Wednesday morning. Victoria had sent word ahead to her solicitor, who met them at the entrance with 2 clerks and an air of barely contained excitement. "Miss Hartley," the solicitor said, a trim man named Pemberton, "your letter was extraordinary. I've prepared preliminary documents and arranged a meeting with the Lord Commissioner himself. He's most interested in reviewing your evidence." The Lord Commissioner of the Treasury, Sir William Hartwell, received them in an oak-panelled office that spoke of centuries of government power. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the cautious expression of a man who'd spent decades navigating political waters. "Lord Ashford, Mr. Carstairs," he said, gesturing to chairs before his desk. "Your petition has reached my attention through rather unusual channels. Miss Hartley's reputation preceded her, and her description of your discoveries is nothing short of remarkable." Edmund placed the document chest on the desk. "Sir William, what we're about to present represents over a century of buried truth. Our families have suffered in silence, bearing the Crown's burden, while receiving neither recognition nor recompense. That silence ends today. They spent 3 hours presenting their case. Victoria organized the evidence methodically, building layer upon layer of documentation. The royal patent, granting Lord Charles Ashford rights to compensation. The cipher notebooks detailing every operation and expense. The architectural plans proving the scope of the network. The letters from Crown officials authorizing operations, and most significantly, the royal decree acknowledging George Carstairs' execution as an injustice, promising compensation that had never been paid. Sir William examined each document carefully, occasionally calling in experts to verify authenticity. His expression remained professionally neutral, but Edmund noticed the Commissioner's hands trembled slightly when he held the decree regarding George Carstairs. "This is authentic," Sir William said finally. "I recognize the seal, the handwriting. This bears King George's own signature, not a proxy. Do you understand what this means?" "It means the Crown has an unpaid debt," Edmund replied firmly. "2 debts, actually, one to each family." "It means more than that." Sir William stood and walked to his window, gazing out at the busy London street below. "This represents a failure of government that spans multiple administrations. The Treasury should have records of these obligations, but somehow they were buried, forgotten, or deliberately suppressed." He turned back to face them. "I'll need to conduct a full audit. These claims, if valid, could amount to substantial sums. With interest accumulated over a century, the totals might be enormous. How long will an audit take?" Carstairs asked, speaking for the first time since entering the office. "Months, potentially. The Treasury's records from the Georgian period are extensive, but not well organized. We'll need to search through decades of accounts." Sir William paused. "However, I can offer you something immediately. Given the strength of your documentation, I'm prepared to issue a formal injunction preventing any sale or seizure of the Thornfield estate pending resolution of these claims." Edmund felt relief flood through him. "That would provide crucial breathing room." "More than that," Victoria interjected. "The injunction itself serves as government acknowledgement that legitimate questions exist regarding Crown obligations." "It gives legal weight to your claims," Sir William nodded. "Precisely. And I'll go further. Based on what I've reviewed today, I'm recommending to the Cabinet that interim payments be made to both families while the full audit is conducted. These won't be the complete amounts owed, but they should be sufficient to stabilize your current situations." Carstairs leaned forward. "Sir William, my family's honor has been in question for 5 generations. Is there any way the Crown can publicly acknowledge the error in my ancestor's execution?" The Commissioner's expression softened slightly. "That's a matter for the Prime Minister and the Crown itself, but I'll include that recommendation in my report. George Carstairs deserves posthumous vindication. and his descendants deserve public restoration of their family name. That evening, they dined at Victoria's London townhouse, the mood celebratory despite exhaustion. Pemberton had worked with remarkable speed, producing the injunction documents that Edmund now carried. Carstairs' creditors had already been notified that the Thornfield property was under legal protection. "We did it," Carstairs said, raising his glass. "After everything, we actually did it." "We did it together," Edmund corrected. "If we'd continued fighting each other, neither of us would have won." Victoria smiled at them both. "You've done more than secure financial compensation. You've uncovered a significant piece of hidden history. The smuggling networks, the intelligence operations, the way the Crown handled its covert agents. Historians will study this for decades." "Let them study," Edmund said. "I'm more interested in what we do now. We have an opportunity to build something lasting, something that honors both our ancestors." Carstairs nodded thoughtfully. "The charitable foundation your ancestor established. We could revive it, expand it, make it serve both our families' names. And the village," Edmund added. "Millbrook has suffered from our family's decline. If we receive the compensation Sir William suggested, we should use it to restore what was lost." They talked late into the night, planning not just the restoration of two families, but the renewal of an entire community. The Ashford Carstairs Foundation, they decided to call it. A partnership that would honor the original alliance their ancestors had formed before tragedy and betrayal tore them apart. The next morning, they prepared to return to Thornfield. Sir William had promised regular updates on the audit's progress and estimated that preliminary payments might be available within 6 weeks. The injunction he'd issued was legally binding and would remain in effect until the matter was fully resolved. As their carriage left London, Edmund watched the city recede behind them. He thought of all the chambers still unexplored beneath Thornfield, all the secrets yet to be uncovered. But now those discoveries would be made in partnership, not conflict. Victoria sat beside him, reviewing notes she'd taken during their meetings. "You know," she said without looking up, "when this is finished, when the foundation is established and the manor restored, you'll need someone to catalogue and preserve all those documents. Create a proper archive of everything you've found. Are you offering your services, Miss Hartley?" Edmund asked, unable to suppress a smile. She looked up, meeting his eyes. "I'm suggesting that some projects require long-term commitment, the kind that can't be completed in a few weeks or even months. Years, possibly." "I see." Edmund felt his heart rate increase. "And would you be willing to make such a long-term commitment?" "To the project, I mean." "To the project," Victoria agreed, but her eyes told him she meant something more. "Among other things," Carstairs, sitting across from them, cleared his throat pointedly. "If you two are finished being deliberately obtuse, some of us would like to celebrate properly. Driver, is there a decent inn ahead? I think this occasion calls for champagne and an early dinner." As they laughed together, Edmund felt something that had been tight in his chest for months finally release. Hope. Real, tangible hope for a future that wasn't just about survival, but about building something worthwhile. His grandfather's burden had been lifted, not through Edmund's efforts alone, but through partnership, truth, and the courage to face long-buried secrets. Jasper would be waiting for them at Thornfield, Edmund thought. The faithful companion who'd started this entire journey by digging in just the right spot. Tomorrow, they'd walk the grounds together, master and dog, surveying an estate that was no longer just a collection of crumbling buildings, but a foundation for renewal. 6 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Edmund and Carstairs worked side by side, clearing more of the underground passages, documenting every chamber, cataloguing every artifact. The relationship between them had transformed from adversarial to genuinely collaborative. Bound by shared purpose and growing mutual respect, Victoria remained at Thornfield, ostensibly to complete her archival work, but increasingly integrated into the household. Mrs. Dalton treated her as if she were already family, and Edmund found himself looking for excuses to consult with her on matters that didn't strictly require her expertise. On a Thursday morning in late November, an official carriage bearing the Treasury seal arrived at Thornfield. Sir William Hartwell himself emerged, accompanied by two clerks carrying heavy document cases. Lord Ashford, Mr. Carstairs, he greeted them formally. "I've come to deliver news in person, rather than through correspondence. This matter deserves that dignity." They assembled in the library, where Victoria joined them, along with Reverend Blackwood and several village witnesses. Sir William arranged papers on the desk with ceremonial precision. "The Treasury audit is complete," he began. "What we discovered exceeded even my considerable expectations. Your family's service to the Crown was far more extensive than initial documentation suggested. When we cross-referenced the cipher notebooks with official records, we found authorization codes that unlocked entire categories of classified operations." He pulled out a leather-bound ledger, clearly new but containing copied historical records. "Lord Charles Ashford and George Carstairs jointly ran operations valued at over £200,000 during the period from 1791 to 1797. They financed much of this from their own resources, expecting reimbursement that never came." Edmund heard Carstairs draw a sharp breath beside him. "Furthermore," Sir William continued, "we found evidence that after George Carstairs' execution, his partner continued operations alone for another 15 years, still bearing costs, still expecting compensation. The total amounts owed, with interest calculated at standard Treasury rates, come to a rather extraordinary sum." He handed separate documents to Edmund and Carstairs. Edmund scanned the figures, scarcely believing what he read. £340,000 sterling to the Ashford estate, £290,000 to the Carstairs estate. Combined, a fortune that would restore both families completely. "But there's more," Sir William said, his expression grave. "The Cabinet has reviewed the circumstances of George Carstairs' execution. Based on evidence you provided and corroborating documents we found in sealed files, the Crown is prepared to issue a formal pardon and public acknowledgement of his service." Carstairs' hands shook as he held the paper. "A pardon? After all these years?" "More than a pardon," Sir William corrected. "A knighthood awarded posthumously. Sir George Carstairs will be recognised as a Crown servant who died in the execution of his duty. His name will be inscribed in the Roll of Honour at Westminster Abbey." The silence that followed was broken only by Carstairs' barely contained sob. Edmund placed a hand on the man's shoulder, sharing the weight of emotion that came with such profound vindication. Sir William produced two more documents, these bearing royal seals. Payment authorization from His Majesty's Treasury. "The funds will be transferred to your designated accounts within 7 days. Additionally, the Crown is offering both families hereditary peerages in recognition of service across multiple generations." Edmund looked at the authorization document in his hands, then at Carstairs, who met his gaze with eyes bright with tears. This was more than money or titles. It was truth acknowledged, honor restored, generations of suffering finally given meaning. "There's one final matter," Sir William said, his tone becoming slightly less formal. "The Crown wishes to purchase the underground network and all associated documents for historical preservation. The price offered is generous, and it includes provisions for both families to maintain access for research purposes. We believe this network represents a significant piece of our nation's hidden history. Will it be made public?" Victoria asked. "The operations, the people involved, the full scope of what was achieved?" "Gradually," Sir William replied. "We'll need to ensure no living persons or ongoing operations are compromised. But yes, eventually this story will be told. Your ancestors' service will be known." Edmund thought of all the chambers still unexplored, all the secrets waiting to be discovered. "We accept the Crown's offer on one condition. The network must be open to qualified researchers. No more burying of inconvenient truths," Sir William nodded. "Agreed. In fact, the Crown intends to establish a research centre, possibly here at Thornfield itself. These passages, this documentation, they're too valuable to remain hidden. After the formal meeting concluded, they gathered in the manor's restored drawing room. The injunctions lifting had allowed Edmund to begin repairs, and the room gleamed with fresh paint and polished woodwork. Mrs. Dalton served tea and the celebratory cake she'd been preparing since morning, somehow certain that good news was coming. To justice delayed but finally delivered, Reverend Blackwood proposed, raising his teacup in toast. And to two families who found wisdom enough to end a feud that served neither. Edmund raised his own cup, meeting Carstairs' eyes across the room. To partnership honoured and renewed. That evening, after the visitors had departed and quiet had returned to Thornfield, Edmund walked the grounds with Victoria. Jasper bounded ahead of them, investigating familiar territories with undiminished enthusiasm. The November air was crisp but not unpleasant, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "You'll be a baron," Victoria observed, "complete with seat in the House of Lords. Quite a change from bankrupt nobleman." "The title means less than the vindication," Edmund replied. "Knowing my grandfather's burden wasn't shame but honour. Knowing the decline wasn't inevitable, but engineered through betrayal. That matters more than any peerage." They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the garden where Jasper had first begun digging. The entrance to the underground passages was now properly secured and marked, waiting to become part of the proposed research centre. "I've been thinking about your earlier comment," Edmund said, "about projects requiring long-term commitment." Victoria stopped, turning to face him. "Have you?" "The foundation will need dedicated leadership. Someone who understands both families' histories, who has expertise in historical preservation, who can navigate between academic research and practical philanthropy." He paused, gathering courage. "Someone I trust completely." "That's quite a job description," Victoria said softly. "It would be easier if that someone were family." Edmund continued, his heart pounding. "Officially. Permanently." Victoria's smile was radiant even in the fading light. "Edmund Ashford, are you proposing?" "I'm suggesting a partnership," he replied, matching her smile. "The kind our ancestors should have maintained, built on trust, mutual respect, and shared vision. And yes, if you're willing, love." She stepped closer, her hand finding his. "Then yes, to partnership, to trust, to shared vision, and most definitely to love." Jasper barked approval, dancing around them as they embraced. Above them, Thornfield Manor stood solid and proud, no longer a monument to decline, but a promise of renewal. The underground passages held secrets still, but those secrets would be discovered together, shared openly, used to build rather than destroy. Edmund thought of his grandfather one final time, that sad old man who died knowing truths he couldn't prove. "Thank you," he thought. "Thank you for keeping faith, for preserving evidence, for believing someone would eventually find the courage to face what you could not." The burden was lifted, the truth was told, and the future, bright with possibility, belonged to those wise enough to learn from the past without being imprisoned by it. 6 months had transformed Thornfield from crumbling ruin into purposeful restoration. Edmund stood in the east garden, watching workers repair the last section of collapsed wall. Spring had arrived with determination, coaxing life from soil that had known only neglect for decades. Roses his great-great-grandmother had planted now climbed renewed trellises, their fragrance carried on the warm breeze. Victoria emerged from the manor carrying a leather portfolio, Jasper trotting contentedly at her side. The dog had grey in, his muzzle now earned through faithful service, but his tail still wagged with the enthusiasm of youth when he saw Edmund. "The archive is officially complete," Victoria announced, joining Edmund at the wall. "Every document catalogued, every cipher translated, every artifact preserved. The first research delegation arrives next week. Edmund took the portfolio, reviewing the meticulously organized records. His wife's work, he thought with pride. They'd married in February, a quiet ceremony in Millbrook's church with both families and the entire village in attendance. Carstairs had stood as his witness, the partnership between their families sealed not just by legal documents, but by genuine friendship. Carstairs sent word from London, Edmund said. The Foundation's charter has received royal approval. The Ashford Carstairs Foundation is officially established. The first schools open in Millbrook and 2 neighbouring villages come autumn. Your grandfather would be proud, Victoria said softly. All of this, the restoration, the foundation, the research centre, it's what he dreamed of, but couldn't achieve. Edmund nodded, remembering the old man's sad eyes, the burden he'd carried silently. Now that burden had become a legacy, something that served not just family pride, but genuine public good. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Thomas Webb rode up, his grandson perched behind him on the saddle. Young Thomas had grown sturdy and healthy, the illness that had nearly claimed him now just a memory. Webb dismounted, helping the boy down. "Sir, the contractors say the museum wing will be ready by midsummer," Webb reported. "They've preserved all the original stonework, just as you requested. It'll be a proper showcase for what was discovered." "Excellent. And the apprenticeship program?" 12 young men started this week, sir, learning building trades, groundskeeping, the practical skills that give a man purpose. Webb's weathered face creased in satisfaction. "It's like the old days my grandfather described. Thornfield as the heart of the community again." Mrs. Dalton appeared on the terrace, waving them inside. "Lord and Lady Ashford, Mr. Carstairs has arrived with guests. He says you'll want to meet them immediately." They found Carstairs in the library, accompanied by 2 elderly men Edmund didn't recognize. Carstairs's expression held barely contained excitement. "Edmund, Victoria, allow me to introduce Professor Whitmore and Dr. Sterling from Oxford. They've been researching the intelligence networks of the Georgian period. When they heard about our discoveries, they insisted on meeting you immediately." The professors examined the archive with reverent care, occasionally exclaiming at particularly significant finds. Professor Whitmore held up the royal warrant, studying it through thick spectacles. "Extraordinary," he breathed. "We've known about covert networks, of course, but never had documented proof of their scope and organization. This will rewrite significant portions of that era's history. And not just military history," Dr. Sterling added, leafing through translated cipher documents. "Look at these entries about refugee resettlement, intelligence gathering, community protection. Your ancestors were practicing what we'd now call integrated security. Military operations combined with humanitarian aid and local infrastructure development. They built systems meant to last," Victoria explained, "not just for war, but for peace. The underground passages weren't merely smuggling routes. They were designed as secure supply lines that could be adapted for multiple purposes." The professors stayed through dinner, discussing potential research projects and asking permission to bring students to study the archive. Edmund granted it gladly, understanding that his family's story had value beyond personal vindication. It offered lessons about service, sacrifice, and the long consequences of government decisions. After the guests departed, Edmund walked to the family cemetery with Victoria. New headstones had been erected beside the old. One bore George Carstairs' name, with his knighthood proudly displayed and dates of service inscribed below. Another was for Lord Charles Ashford, its inscription updated to reflect his true role in Crown service. "Partnership honoured," Victoria read from Charles's stone. "Truth preserved, legacy restored." "Simple words for a complicated story," Edmund observed. "The best epitaphs are," Victoria replied. She placed a hand on her still, flat stomach, a gesture Edmund had noticed her making frequently in recent weeks. I was waiting for the right moment to tell you. Dr. Mansfield confirmed it this morning. We're going to have a child. Edmund felt joy surge through him, so powerful it nearly overwhelmed his ability to speak. A child. The next generation of Ashfords, born not into decline and shame, but into renewed purpose and restored honor. He or she will grow up differently than we did, Edmund finally managed, with both families' histories acknowledged, with the truth told. And with the burden transformed into opportunity, Victoria added. That's what your grandfather hoped for, isn't it? Not just vindication, but the chance to build something better. They walked back to the manor as twilight deepened into evening. Inside, lights glowed in every window, no longer the domain of ghosts and secrets, but a home filled with purpose and promise. The underground passages, once hiding places for desperate truths, now awaited researchers who would share those truths with the world. Edmund paused at the entrance, looking back at the grounds he'd arrived at 6 months ago, with nothing but a bankrupt title and a faithful dog. Jasper sat beside him, as he always did, companion through every discovery, every danger, every triumph. "Well, old friend," Edmund said, scratching the dog's ears, "you started all this, you know. If you hadn't begun digging where you did, none of this would have happened." Jasper's tail thumped agreement, and Edmund could have sworn the dog was smiling. Inside, Mrs. Dalton had prepared a simple supper for family. Carstairs had stayed, reluctant to return to London when Thornfield offered such warmth and camaraderie. They ate together, talking not of past glories, but of future plans. More schools, better roads, medical services for outlying villages, all the dreams Lord Charles and George Carstairs had once shared, now finally being realized by their descendants. Later, lying in bed with Victoria beside him, Edmund listened to the manor's familiar sounds. No more mysterious footsteps in the night. No more groaning timbers and unexplained noises. The house had yielded its secrets willingly, and now rested peacefully, its purpose fulfilled. His grandfather's pocket watch sat on the nightstand, its hands still frozen at midnight. Edmund had considered having it repaired, but decided against it. Let it stand as it was, a reminder of time suspended, of truths waiting to be discovered. Time had stood still for those who waited beneath, just as the inscription promised. But now time moved forward again, carrying with it hope and renewal. Edmund closed his eyes, one hand resting protectively on Victoria's stomach, the other reaching down.